I stood at the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse, wearing a suit that cost more than my son-in-law's entire luxury car collection. My daughter Maya let out a loud, mocking laugh as I walked in, thinking I was just a senile old man who had hired a cheap mall lawyer to fight her. Preston, her husband, would not even look at me. But when the judge opened the defense folder, all the color drained from his face. His hands started shaking right there on the bench. He leaned into the microphone and whispered, "Is this really happening?" In that exact moment, the smug smiles vanished from my family's faces. They were about to learn that they had no idea who I truly was. Before I continue this story, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light no matter how hard people try to bury it. My name is Russell, and I had just turned 75 years old. To celebrate, my daughter Maya and her husband Preston invited me to a high-end steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and the menu does not show the prices. I wore my best Sunday suit, brushing off the dust from the shoulders, feeling a quiet warmth in my chest. I thought my family wanted to honor me. I thought we were finally having a real family dinner. I was wrong. The main courses had just been cleared away. I was taking a sip of sparkling water when Preston leaned back in his leather chair. He was a wealthy tech real estate CEO, always wearing custom-tailored suits and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He did not hand me a birthday card. He did not hand me a wrapped gift. Instead, he reached into his designer briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed his manicured hand on top of it and slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped right in front of my plate. "Happy birthday, Russell," he said. His voice was smooth but dripping with a condescending tone that made my stomach turn. "Go ahead and open it." I looked at Maya. She was suddenly completely fascinated by the stem of her wine glass. She would not meet my eyes. My calloused hands reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. The bold black letters at the top of the legal document felt like a physical blow to my chest. Petition for conservatorship. I stared at the words, trying to process the magnitude of what I was looking at. A conservatorship meant they were petitioning the state to strip me of all my legal rights. It meant they wanted the court to declare me mentally incompetent. It would give Preston total control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my home. It would reduce me, a grown man who had survived a war and built a life from nothing, to the legal status of a toddler. I slowly looked up from the paper and fixed my eyes on Preston. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. Preston let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, acting as if he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "It is for your own good, Pops," he said, leaning forward. "We have to face reality. Your mind is slipping. The Alzheimer's is getting worse, and Maya and I just cannot sit back and watch you endanger yourself anymore." "I do not have Alzheimer's," I replied calmly. "My doctor gave me a clean bill of health just last month." Preston offered a patronizing smile. "You are confused, Russell. Just last week you forgot to pay the light bill at the South Side house. The company sent a final notice. If I had not stepped in, you would have been sitting in the dark, freezing. You cannot manage your own life anymore." A cold fury began to pulse in my veins. I had not forgotten to pay the light bill. I always pay my bills on the first of the month. But 3 weeks ago, I saw Preston's sleek black Porsche parked down the street from my house. I watched from my kitchen window as he walked up to my porch, opened my mailbox, and slipped a stack of envelopes into his coat pocket before driving away. He had stolen my mail to create a false paper trail of my incompetence. He was manufacturing evidence to steal my life. I turned my gaze to my only child. "Maya," I said softly. "Maya, look at me." She finally raised her head, but her eyes were cold and distant. "Do not make this harder than it has to be." "Dad," she snapped, her voice tight with irritation. "Preston is right. You are getting old. You are forgetting things. We are just trying to protect you." "Protect me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Before I could say another word, Preston reached across the table and swiftly snatched the worn leather keychain sitting next to my water glass, the keys to my 1969 Ford truck, the truck I had restored with my own 2 hands. "Hey," I said, my voice finally rising slightly. Preston tossed the keys over his shoulder to his private driver, who was standing discreetly near the coat check. "You are not driving anymore, Russell," he said with terrifying authority. "It is a massive liability. You could run over a child in your condition. My driver will take the truck to a secure lot. We will drive you back to your house tonight." They had planned every detail. They had boxed me in, surrounded by wealthy strangers and expensive food, executing a hostile takeover of my entire existence. They expected me to scream. They expected me to throw a fit, bang my fists on the table, and yell about disrespect. They wanted me to cause a scene so the restaurant manager would call the police. An angry, confused old black man shouting in a fine dining restaurant would be the perfect police report to submit to a judge as proof of my mental instability. But I am not a foolish man. I recognized a trap when I saw one. I looked down at the table. The waiter had just brought out dessert. It was a red velvet cake. Vivian's recipe. My late wife used to make it for me every year on my birthday. Maya had given the restaurant the recipe just to put on a show of being a loving daughter while simultaneously signing away my freedom. The irony was so bitter it coated the back of my throat. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly folded my cloth napkin and placed it neatly next to the untouched cake. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Sit down, Russell," Preston commanded, his fake smile dropping instantly. His voice took on the sharp edge of a master speaking to a disobedient servant. "We are not finished discussing this." I looked down at him. For a brief second I let the mask slip. I let him see the absolute coldness in my eyes. "I am finished," I said. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. Dad Maya called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet dining room. "Where are you going? You do not have your car." I did not answer. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, whipping snow against my face like tiny pieces of glass. The cold cut right through my Sunday suit, but I barely felt it. My heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic intensity. They thought they had outsmarted a tired old mechanic. They thought I was weak. But as I walked down the icy pavement, disappearing into the shadows of the city, a dark smile crept onto my face. Preston wanted to play a game of ruthless corporate theft. He had no idea he had just declared war on a man who owned the board. The freezing wind of downtown Chicago hit my face the second I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. I knew exactly what Preston was doing right at that moment. I knew he was sitting in his warm leather chair, sipping his expensive wine and watching me through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. He expected me to stumble. He expected me to wander aimlessly down the icy pavement like a confused old man whose mind was slipping away. He wanted me to look pathetic because that would validate the legal papers he had just shoved in my face. He wanted the narrative of the helpless father to begin tonight. But the moment I turned the corner and disappeared from his line of sight, my entire posture changed. I stopped shivering. I straightened my back, pulling my shoulders squarely together. I did not stumble, and I did not wander. My mind was sharper than it had been in 20 years. Preston thought he was playing chess with a retired mechanic. He had no idea he had just kicked a sleeping bear. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my chest and began to walk. I did not head toward the main street to hail a cab. I knew Preston would be tracking my cell phone. He probably had an application installed on it months ago under the disguise of setting up my new device. So I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the smartphone Maya had bought for me last Christmas, and dropped it straight into a snow-filled trash can on the corner of State Street. Let him track that. I walked exactly 3 blocks east and 2 blocks south. I moved with absolute precision through the dark alleys that I knew better than the back of my hand. I had walked these exact streets back in the 70s when I was building my empire brick by brick. Preston was a boy who inherited a tech company and thought he understood the world. But he only understood numbers on a screen. He did not understand survival. He did not understand the kind of ruthless calculation it took for a black man to build a billion-dollar logistics network from a single broken-down delivery truck. I reached my destination. It was an old laundromat with flickering neon lights that had been closed for the night. Right outside the rusted security gate stood a relic of the past, a coin-operated payphone. It was one of the few left in the city untraceable and completely off the grid. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handful of change. I dropped the coins into the slot, hearing the heavy metallic clink that I had not heard in years. I picked up the cold plastic receiver and dialed a private number I had committed to memory over a decade ago. It rang only twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "Speak," the voice said. "Dawson," I replied, my breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "It is Russell." There was a brief pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me Dawson was immediately shifting gears from his evening routine to wartime status. Dawson was not just an attorney. He was a high-powered legal fixer who handled the darkest, most complex problems for the city elite. I had kept him on a massive retainer for 20 years, paid through an anonymous offshore trust. Preston thought Maya and I shared the same cheap family lawyer. He had no idea I owned the man who made state senators sweat. Mr. Montgomery Dawson, said, his tone shifting to absolute respect. I did not expect to hear from you tonight. Happy birthday, sir. Cancel the birthday wishes, I said, staring out into the dark street. We have a situation. Plan B is officially activated. The wolves are at the door. Dawson did not gasp or ask unnecessary questions. He was a professional. Who is the target, he asked simply. Preston, I said, and Maya. They just ambushed me at dinner with a petition for conservatorship. They are trying to declare me mentally incompetent to seize control of the estate. They took my truck. They are tracking my daily movements. They think I am a senile old fool who forgot to pay his light bill. I heard the sound of a leather chair creaking as Dawson leaned forward in his office. A conservatorship, he repeated. That is a bold move. It is also incredibly stupid. If they open up your financial history to a federal judge, they are going to find a lot more than a checking account and an old house. They are not going to find anything, I interrupted, my voice hardening, because you are going to bury the interstate logistics connection deeper than it has ever been. They want to play a game of control, so we are going to give them control over a ghost. But first I need to know their immediate moves. I am pulling the court filings right now, Dawson said, the rapid clicking of a keyboard echoing through the phone. Yes, I see it. Filed this afternoon under an emergency protective order. Preston moved fast. He has a preliminary hearing scheduled to freeze your local bank accounts by tomorrow morning. Let him freeze them, I said. It is pocket change. I will meet you tomorrow to begin the counteroffensive. Understood, Dawson replied. Where are you right now? The temperature is dropping fast. Do you need me to send a car to take you to the penthouse? No, I said, gripping the phone tightly. I am going back to the South Side house. I need to play the role of the helpless old man locked out in the cold. Let them build their false confidence tonight. The higher they climb, the harder I am going to break their legs when they fall. I hung up the phone. The metallic click echoed in the quiet street. I pulled my collar up against the biting wind and began the long transit back to my neighborhood. I took 2 different buses, ensuring no one was following me. By the time I reached the South Side, the snow was falling heavily, covering the cracked sidewalks in a thick blanket of white. I walked up the familiar pathway to the 2-story wooden house I had shared with Vivian. It was a modest home. I could have bought a mansion in the suburbs decades ago, but Vivian loved this neighborhood, and I loved Vivian. After she passed away, this house became my sanctuary. It was the one place where I was just Russell, the husband and father, not Russell, the shadow billionaire. I stepped onto the wooden porch, shivering violently now. The cold was finally seeping into my bones. I reached into my deep coat pocket and pulled out my house key. I walked up to the heavy oak front door and slid the key into the deadbolt. It stopped halfway. I frowned and tried to push it further, but the metal ground against metal. The key would not go in. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light of the porch lamp. The brass lock was completely shiny and brand new. My heart went entirely still. I looked down at the door frame. There were fresh wood shavings scattered on the welcome mat. I stepped back and looked at the front window. The curtains, which I always kept open at night, were drawn completely shut. Preston had not just ambushed me at the restaurant. That was only a distraction. While I was sitting there looking at my birthday cake, Preston had sent a team of private contractors to my home. They had drilled out the locks, changed the deadbolts, and locked me out of my own house in the dead of winter. A piece of paper was taped to the glass of the front door. I ripped it off and held it up to the light. It was a formal legal notice printed on thick, expensive paper. Property of Preston Real Estate Holdings. No trespassing. He was moving faster than I anticipated. He was trying to force me out into the street, hoping I would freeze or wander into a homeless shelter so the police could pick me up and document my inability to care for myself. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. If I were truly just an old retired mechanic, this night would have destroyed me. I would have been crying on the porch, banging my fists against the door, begging my neighbors for help. I crumpled the notice in my fist. The sheer disrespect of it burned hotter than any fire. They had violated the home where my wife had lived. They had locked me out of my own memories. Maya had sat there drinking her wine, knowing perfectly well that her husband was changing the locks on her father's home at that exact second. I stood on the freezing porch, the snow gathering on my shoulders. The street was completely empty. The temperature was dropping below 10 degrees. Any normal man my age would be in serious medical danger. I needed to move. Suddenly, a pair of bright halogen headlights cut through the heavy snowfall at the end of the alley. The lights moved slowly, deliberately, gliding over the snow-covered pavement without a single sound. A massive, sleek, black Phantom Rolls-Royce town car pulled up directly in front of my house. The vehicle stopped. The engine hummed with a quiet, terrifying power. The dark-tinted window of the back seat slowly rolled down. Dawson was sitting inside, illuminated by the soft blue glow of a laptop screen. He looked immaculate in a dark, tailored suit, his eyes scanning the frozen front porch and the new brass locks on my door. He looked at the crumpled eviction notice in my hand. "It seems the wolves are moving faster than we thought," Mr. Montgomery Dawson said, his voice cutting clearly through the howling wind. "Are you ready to get to work?" I looked at the locked door of my house one last time. I let the crumpled piece of paper fall from my hand into the snow. I walked down the porch steps and opened the heavy door of the town car. The rich smell of leather and warm air washed over me. I slid into the back seat and closed the door, shutting out the cold completely. "Burn it to the ground," I said, staring straight ahead into the darkness. "Burn it all down." The town car smoothly pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the snowstorm. The shadow war had officially begun. The morning sun barely cut through the heavy gray clouds hanging over Chicago. I woke up in a luxury hotel suite paid for by Dawson, but I did not dress like a man who spent the night in a five-star bed. I put on my old grease-stained mechanic coveralls and my heavy steel toe work boots. It was the exact uniform I had worn for 40 years. I needed to look the part of the vulnerable old man Preston painted me out to be. I needed the world to see me as weak, so they would document my struggle. I walked into a small corner diner near my old neighborhood to buy a simple cup of black coffee. The diner was full of working-class people trying to get warm before their shifts. The bell on the door chimed and the waitress smiled at me. I ordered my coffee and handed her my plastic debit card. She swiped it once, and the machine beeped a harsh red tone. She frowned and swiped it again. The machine beeped again, louder this time. A few people sitting at the counter turned to look. "I am sorry, Russell," she said, looking confused and a little embarrassed for me. "It says the card is declined." Declined. The word hung in the air, smelling of cheap diner coffee and frying bacon. I knew exactly how much money was in that personal checking account. It was a modest amount, just enough to pay my monthly utility bills and buy groceries. It was the public account. The account Preston knew about. The account he thought represented my entire life savings. I patted my pockets, pretending to look for loose change, playing the part of the confused elderly man. The whispers started around me. People were watching an old man who could not even afford a $2 cup of coffee. I gave the waitress a $10 bill from my secret stash and walked out into the freezing morning air without taking the drink. Preston was moving at a terrifying speed. He had locked me out of my house last night, and now less than 12 hours later he was cutting off my financial oxygen. He wanted me starving and desperate. I walked 3 blocks down the street to the local branch of the First National Bank. The wind was brutal, but my anger kept me warm. The security guard nodded at me as I pushed through the revolving doors. I walked straight up to the teller counter. The young woman behind the glass looked at my worn-out clothes with a mixture of professional courtesy and subtle pity. I told her my card was declined at the diner and asked her to check my account status. She typed my name into her computer and her face immediately dropped. She stopped typing and looked around nervously before leaning close to the thick glass partition. "Mr. Montgomery," she whispered softly, treating me like a fragile piece of glass. "Your account has been completely frozen. There is a legal hold placed on it as of 8 o'clock this morning. I cannot dispense any funds to you." I played the part perfectly. I widened my eyes and let my hands tremble just slightly on the counter. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look smaller and more defeated. "A hold," I asked, letting my voice crack with fake emotion. "But how am I supposed to buy food? Who did this to me?" The teller looked at me with deep sorrow in her eyes. "It was your son-in-law, Preston," she explained, gently placing her hand on the glass. "He came in as soon as we opened. He filed an emergency court order. He told the bank manager that your mind is failing rapidly and that you have been wandering the streets giving your money away to strangers. He said he had to freeze everything for your own protection until the judge signs the final conservatorship papers on Friday." For my own protection. The audacity of the lie almost made me laugh out loud right there in the quiet bank lobby. He was painting a picture of me as a crazy old man handing out cash on street corners just to justify his theft. But as I stood there playing the confused victim, a sudden realization hit me like a freight train. It hit me so hard I almost dropped my act. Preston was the chief executive officer of a massive real estate technology firm. He drove $100,000 cars and wore custom Italian suits. He lived in a gated mansion in the northern suburbs with my daughter Maya. Why would a man with that level of extreme wealth move so aggressively to seize control of a simple checking account with barely $20,000 in it? Why drill the locks on a modest South Side house in the middle of the night? It did not make sense. Wealthy men who want control take their time. They use lawyers to slowly bleed you dry over months. They do not rush down to a local bank at 8 in the morning to freeze a meager checking account. They do not steal keys at a dinner table. Preston was acting like a man whose hair was on fire. He was panicked. He was rushing. He was not just trying to put me in a nursing home to get me out of the way. He was desperately, frantically searching for liquid cash. My mind started racing, putting the pieces together. I thought back to the dinner last night. Maya had looked stressed. Her designer dress was from last season, and she had not ordered her usual expensive champagne. Preston had dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive cologne could hide. His hands had been shaking slightly when he handed me the court papers. They were broke. Or worse, they owed money to people who did not accept apologies. They were drowning, and they were trying to use my small public estate as a life raft to keep themselves afloat. If Preston was willing to destroy my life and strip me of my human rights just to get his hands on my basic checking account and my old house, it meant his own empire was built on sand. He was a fraud. I thanked the teller in a shaky voice, wiping a fake tear from my eye. I slowly turned away from the counter, dragging my heavy boots across the marble floor. I let everyone in the lobby see the broken old man whose family had betrayed him. But once I was out of sight of the main teller windows, I did not leave the bank. My posture changed instantly. The tremble in my hands vanished. The confusion in my eyes was replaced by cold, hard focus. I walked past the main lobby and headed straight toward the heavy steel doors in the back corridor. This was the restricted access area leading to the private underground vaults. The security guard stepped in front of me immediately, raising his hand to block my path. "Sir, the safety deposit boxes are closed to the public right now," he said, his voice stern. "You need to go back to the lobby." I looked him dead in the eye and dropped the old man act completely. I stood up straight, towering over him, and spoke with a voice that commanded boardrooms and terrified executives. "My name is Russell Montgomery," I said smoothly, "and I am not the public." I reached into the hidden lining of my greasy coveralls and pulled out a solid black titanium card. It had no numbers and no bank logo. It only had a single magnetic strip and a gold chip. It was a legacy access key granted only to the founding tier clients of the financial institution. Clients who had deposited more than $50 million in cash assets. The guard looked him the black card and his face instantly turned pale. He recognized the metal. He knew exactly what kind of power was standing in front of him, dressed in dirty mechanic clothes. He swallowed hard and stepped aside, swiping his master key to open the heavy steel doors without saying another word. I walked past him and descended the marble staircase into the silent, glowing vault below the city. Preston thought he had frozen my life. He thought he had locked me out. He thought he had left me penniless and starving on the streets. But Preston did not know about the underground vault. He did not know about the ghost network I had built decades ago. And he certainly did not know about the documents my late wife Vivian had hidden down there before she died. Documents that were about to tear his fake empire to shreds. Let him have the $20,000 in the checking account. By the time I was finished with him, he was going to be begging me for a single dollar. The air in the underground vault was heavy and perfectly climate-controlled. The thick steel doors closed behind me with a solid mechanical thud, shutting out the noise of the city above. I walked down the long corridor of polished metal boxes, my heavy steel toe boots echoing loudly in the quiet space. The bank manager walked silently beside me, his eyes glued to the floor. He knew better than to ask questions. He knew the dirty, worn-out coveralls I was wearing were just a costume. We reached the private section at the very back of the vault reserved for the founding tier clients. Box 804. I pulled out the small brass key I kept hidden inside the lining of my right boot. But as I reached for the lock, I stopped. My hand hovered in the freezing air. The small red security seal placed over the keyhole was deeply scratched. The thick wax had been chipped away. Someone had taken a blade to it, trying to pry it open by force. I turned my head slowly and looked at the bank manager. He swallowed hard, his face turning pale under the fluorescent lights. He quickly explained that yesterday afternoon, just hours before my birthday dinner, a young man in a custom-tailored suit came into the bank waving a legal power of attorney document. He demanded immediate access to this exact safe deposit box. The manager told me the young man was sweating profusely, screaming at the tellers and threatening to sue the bank to the ground if they did not open the vault. But the bank fraud department is incredibly strict. They ran the document through their system and instantly flagged the signature as a clumsy forgery. They turned him away, threatening to call the police if he did not leave the premises. Preston. It was Preston. He was not just arrogant. He was acting like a drowning man grasping at straws. He was desperate enough to commit federal bank fraud in broad daylight. I nodded slowly and dismissed the manager, telling him to wait by the main doors. Once I was alone, I broke the rest of the damaged red seal and slid my brass key into the lock. The heavy metal clicked and the long drawer slid open. Inside, there were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no diamonds or gold bars. There were only 2 items. I reached in and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was the original paper deed to my house on the south side. The exact house Preston had just locked me out of. And right beneath the deed was a thick leather-bound ledger from 1985. I ran my calloused fingers over the cracked leather. This ledger was the true heartbeat of my empire. It was the very first accounting book my wife Vivian and I used when we started our trucking company with just one broken-down vehicle. Every drop of blood, sweat, and tears we poured into our future was written on these fragile pages. In those days, we ate instant noodles and slept in the cab of the truck just to make sure our drivers got paid. Preston thought I was just an old mechanic who got lucky with a pension. He had no idea this book was the foundation of a logistics network that now controlled 30% of the freight on the East Coast. I tucked the deed and the ledger safely inside my coat, pressing them close to my chest, and pushed the metal drawer shut. I left the bank through a private underground exit that led directly into a secure parking garage. Dawson was waiting for me in the shadows, sitting in the back of the black Phantom town car. Beside him was a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a plain gray suit and had the quiet, invisible look of a man who spent his life hunting people in the dark. Dawson introduced him as his lead private investigator. I sat down on the rich leather seats, and the car pulled away, slipping smoothly into the freezing Chicago traffic. I handed the ledger to Dawson and leaned back against the seat. I told them about the scratched seal on the vault. I told them Preston had tried to forge his way into my safety deposit box hours before he handed me the conservatorship papers at the restaurant. The investigator opened a thick black folder resting on his lap. He did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He looked at me with dead serious eyes and dropped the first bomb. He told me that Preston was not a successful tech executive. His entire real estate software company was a massive illusion. It was a Ponzi scheme built on empty promises, fake investors, and manipulated spreadsheets. Preston had been shifting millions of dollars from new clients to pay off the old ones just to keep the lights on and maintain the illusion of his luxury lifestyle. He bought the mansion, the sports cars, and the designer clothes using stolen money. But the money had finally run out. The investigator flipped to the next page in the folder. And worse, Preston had borrowed from the wrong people to cover his tracks. The investigator slid a glossy photograph across the leather seat. It showed Preston standing in a dark underground parking garage, looking terrified while talking to 2 massive men with heavy Russian tattoos crawling up their necks. Preston owes $50 million to a Russian organized crime syndicate, the investigator said, his voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. They fronted him the cash to keep his company afloat last year, and they gave him until the end of this month to pay it back in full. If he does not produce the money by Friday, they are going to kill him. And they will not stop with him. They will go after Maya too. I stared at the photograph. My blood ran completely cold. The pieces of the puzzle were finally slamming into place with terrifying clarity. The sudden fake Alzheimer diagnosis, the emergency court orders to strip me of my rights, the freezing of my checking account. Preston was a dead man walking, and he was trying to use my life as a shield to save himself. He did not care about my health. He cared about his own survival. But one major piece still did not make any sense. I looked up at Dawson, my brow furrowed in deep concentration. Why the house, I asked. Why drill the locks and kick me out of a modest 2-story home on the south side? Even if Preston forces me into a nursing home and sells the house in a fire sale, it is only worth maybe $300,000 at best. That is pocket change. That is not nearly enough to pay off a $50 million debt to the Russian mob. It does not add up. Dawson exchanged a dark, knowing look with the investigator. The investigator reached into the back of his folder and pulled out a large topographical survey map of the city of Chicago. He unfolded it across the wide leather seat, tracing a thick blue line that ran directly underneath my property on the south side. "It is not the house, Mr. Montgomery," the investigator said softly, pointing the tip of his pen at my address. "It is the dirt underneath it." He tapped the map emphatically. "Your property sits directly on top of the largest subterranean water rights vein in the entire state. The city council has been secretly planning a massive infrastructure project for the past 2 years to buy up that land and secure the water supply for the next century. But because your wife Vivian filed a very specific, highly ironclad legacy deed back in the 1980s, the city cannot just seize the land through eminent domain. They are legally forced to buy the water rights directly from the owner of the deed." The investigator paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet car. "We intercepted the confidential city planning documents at 3 o'clock this morning. The city is prepared to offer an unlisted emergency payout of $100 million for your specific plot of land. The deal closes next Monday." The silence in the car was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine and the tires cutting through the snow on the road. $100 million. Preston had somehow intercepted my mail and found out about the secret city buyout. He knew I was sitting on a gold mine and did not even realize it. He did not care about my well-being. He did not care about his marriage to Maya. He just needed me declared legally brain dead by a federal judge so he could legally transfer the deed over to himself. He was going to sell the water rights to the city, take the $100 million, pay off the Russian mob, and disappear into the sunset as a wealthy man. He was willing to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward to rot and die just so he could walk away from his own failures. He was going to erase my entire existence to save his own pathetic life. I looked out the tinted window at the gray sky hanging over the city. The lingering sadness I had felt yesterday, the quiet heartbreak of seeing my daughter look away from me at the dinner table, it was all completely gone. It evaporated, leaving nothing but a cold, burning focus. There was no more room for pity. There was no more room for family therapy or second chances. There was only the cold, hard reality of war. I turned back to Dawson. My voice was no longer that of an old father. It was the voice of the man who built interstate logistics. "Let him think he is winning," I said, leaning forward. "Let him bring his fake real estate appraisers to my house. Let him think I am broken. Because when he reaches his hand out to take that $100 million, I am going to chop it off at the wrist. Make the preparations, Dawson. We are going to buy his debt." Dawson smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile. "It will be done, Mr. Montgomery." The car sped up, heading toward the city center. Preston thought he was playing a brilliant game of survival. He had no idea he had just walked right into a graveyard. I sat in the back of the black town car watching the freezing rain hit the tinted glass. The information Dawson and the investigator had given me was a heavy weight on my chest. Preston was a dead man walking. He owed $50 million to men who did not forgive debt. He was trying to steal my property to sell the water rights to the city for $100 million. That part was clear. The mathematics of his betrayal made perfect sense. But there was one variable that kept me awake all night: my daughter, Maya. I needed to know. I had to look into the eyes of my only child and find out if she was a victim of her husband's manipulation or if she was a willing accomplice. Did Preston lie to her? Did he tell her I was truly sick and needed medical help? Or did she know exactly what he was doing behind my back? If I unleashed my full power against Preston, it would destroy Maya too. I had to give her one final chance to step away from the fire. I had to know if the little girl I raised was still in there somewhere. Dawson had his people track Maya's phone. She was having a late morning brunch at an upscale bistro in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It was the kind of place where wealthy socialites drank $20 lattes and gossiped about country club memberships while ignoring the homeless people sitting just outside the glass windows. I told Dawson to park down the street. I stepped out of the luxury car wearing the same dirty mechanic coveralls and worn-out steel toe boots. I let my shoulders slump forward. I made my breathing shallow and erratic. I stepped back into the role of the terrified, helpless father. I walked toward the bistro. The cold wind bit into my face, but I ignored it. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, and the warmth of the room hit me instantly, smelling of expensive roasted coffee and fresh pastries. The hostess, a young woman in a sharp black suit, looked at me with immediate disgust. She stepped forward, ready to throw me out, thinking I was a vagrant wandering in from the street. I ignored her and shuffled slowly across the polished hardwood floor, my boots squeaking loudly. I saw Maya sitting in a velvet booth near the large front window. She was wearing a silk blouse and a diamond necklace. It was the exact necklace I had bought for her high school graduation after saving my extra overtime pay for 6 months. Her designer handbag sat on the chair next to her. She was typing furiously on her smartphone, completely absorbed in her wealthy little world. "Maya," I said, letting my voice crack and waver just enough to sound pathetic. She looked up and her face instantly turned pale. She did not smile. She did not reach out to me. Instead, she quickly looked around the bustling bistro to see if any of her wealthy friends had noticed the homeless-looking man standing at her table. Her eyes darted back to me, filled with panic and deep irritation. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she hissed, leaning forward and lowering her voice so the neighboring tables would not hear. "How did you find me? You cannot just wander around the city looking like this. You are embarrassing me." I let my hands shake visibly. I reached out and gently held the edge of the cold marble table. "Maya, please," I whispered, my voice sounding broken and exhausted. "You have to help me." Preston locked me out of the house. He changed the front locks in the middle of the night. I went to the bank this morning and the lady told me my money is gone. He froze my account, Maya. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I slept out in the freezing cold. I waited for the shock. I waited for her to gasp and say she had no idea what Preston had done. I prayed to God she would stand up and hug me and tell me it was all a massive, terrible misunderstanding. I wanted her to be innocent. Instead, she let out a long, exasperated sigh. She pinched the bridge of her nose, acting completely annoyed. She looked at me not with love or concern, but with the same disgust the hostess had shown me moments earlier. "Dad, keep your voice down," she whispered sharply. "Preston told me you would act like this. He said your mind is playing tricks on you again. We had to freeze the accounts because you are a danger to yourself. You are losing your memory. You are probably just confused about the locks. You probably put the wrong key in the door." "I am not confused," I pleaded, letting a single tear roll down my weathered cheek. "Maya, he is trying to take everything. He filed legal papers to put me in a home. Please tell him to stop. I am your father. I took care of you your whole life. You know I am not sick. Look at me, Maya. Look into my eyes. You know my mind is perfectly fine." She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. She took a sip of her sparkling water, pretending to check a notification on her phone. The silence between us was heavier than concrete. I gave her every opportunity to confess. I gave her an open door to save her soul and return to her family. Then she slammed that door completely shut. "Stop being so incredibly selfish," she snapped, her voice cold and dripping with resentment. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Selfish. I had worked 14-hour shifts, crawling under leaking diesel trucks so she could attend elite private schools. I had paid for her college tuition in full so she would never know the burden of a student loan. I had given her everything. "You are 75 years old, Dad," she continued, her tone filled with pure venom. "You are sitting in an empty house in a bad neighborhood holding on to the past. Do you have any idea what kind of stress Preston and I are under right now? Do you even care about my life? The real estate market is tough. Our investors are pulling back their funding. If we do not get a massive influx of cash by next week, we are going to lose the summer house in the Hamptons. We will be kicked out of the country club. My entire life, my social circle, everything I have built will be completely ruined." I stared at her. The fake trembling in my hands slowly began to stop. "You are selling my life to keep a summer house?" I asked, my voice dropping a fraction of an octave, losing some of the fake weakness. "It is not just a summer house," she hissed, leaning closer across the table, her eyes wide with desperate greed. "It is our survival in this society. Preston says your property is worth an absolute fortune if we just sell it to the municipal buyers who want the water rights. You do not need that land. You do not need a house that big. You can live perfectly fine in the assisted living facility Preston found for you. It has a nice garden. They will feed you and watch you. Why do you have to make this so difficult for us? Why can you not just do this one thing for me after everything Preston and I have done to tolerate you?" Tolerate you. The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing around my skull until it crushed the last remaining piece of fatherly hope I had left. I looked closely at the woman sitting in front of me. She had my late wife's eyes, but there was absolutely nothing of Vivian inside her. Vivian was a woman of honor. Vivian would have starved in the streets before she betrayed her own blood for a country club membership. Maya was completely hollow. She knew Preston was stealing my home. She knew about the secret city payout for the water rights. She knew I was perfectly sane, and she simply did not care. She was willing to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward where I would likely die of a broken heart just so she could drink expensive champagne with her wealthy friends in the Hamptons. She was not a victim. She was a monster. And the bitter truth was that I had helped create her by giving her too much wealth and demanding too little character. "Dad," she said, looking at her diamond watch impatiently. "Preston is sending his driver to pick you up in 10 minutes. Just sit here quietly and drink a coffee. Do not make a scene and embarrass me further. I have to go to a charity lunch in downtown. Just accept the conservatorship. Sign the papers when Preston brings them. It will be easier for everyone if you just surrender." She grabbed her designer handbag, stood up from the velvet booth, and walked away. She did not look back. She did not say goodbye. She just walked out the glass doors of the bistro, leaving her father standing in dirty coveralls, looking like a discarded piece of trash. I stood there for a long moment, watching her get into a sleek silver sports car that pulled up to the curb. The engine roared and she drove away into the gray city traffic. As the car disappeared down the street, the terrified, confused old man vanished entirely. I stood up perfectly straight. My shoulders broadened, pushing against the fabric of the old coveralls. The fake tear on my cheek dried in the warm air of the cafe. My heart, which had been breaking all morning, finally snapped shut. There was no more love left to give to her. There was only the cold, empty space where a father's mercy used to reside. I reached into the deep pocket of my coveralls and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I dialed the secure line. Dawson answered on the first ring. "Are you all right, Mr. Montgomery?" he asked, his voice respectful but cautious, knowing the emotional toll this meeting must have taken. "I am fine, Dawson," I replied, my voice as hard and cold as a sheet of winter ice. "I have my answer. The daughter I raised is dead. The woman who just walked out of here is nothing but a parasite." "What are your orders, sir?" Dawson asked without hesitation. I looked down at the half-empty glass of sparkling water Maya had left on the marble table, a symbol of everything she valued over human life. "Accelerate the timeline," I said smoothly, walking toward the exit. "Let Preston bring his fake real estate appraiser to my house this afternoon. Let him think the trap is successfully closing around me. Let him believe I am broken. But I want you to contact our proxy agents in New York and London immediately. I want the V Legacy Trust to completely absorb his $50 million debt from the Russian syndicate by tomorrow morning. Pay them whatever premium they want. Just get the paper. I want to own Preston completely before the sun goes down tomorrow." "Understood," Sir Dawson said. "And what about your daughter?" "Do not protect her," I said, stepping through the doors and walking back out into the freezing Chicago rain. "She wanted to play the ruthless game of the wealthy elite. Let her feel what happens when you sit at the high rollers table and lose everything. Burn it all down, Dawson. Leave them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs." I walked down the wet pavement toward the waiting town car. The shadow war was over. The execution had officially begun. I sat on the frozen wooden steps of my front porch waiting for them to arrive. Dawson had already sent a security team earlier that morning to discreetly bypass the new locks Preston had installed, but I chose to sit outside in the extreme cold. I needed Preston to see me exactly how he wanted to see me. Defeated. Broken. A helpless old man who had been locked out of his own life and had nowhere else to go. Around 2:00 in the afternoon, a shiny silver luxury sedan pulled up to the curb. Preston stepped out wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than the cars parked on my street. With him was a short, nervous-looking man clutching a thick leather clipboard. This was the crooked appraiser. I knew exactly what they were here to do. Preston walked up this concrete walkway with a sickeningly smug smile on his face. He looked at me shivering on the steps and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Look at you, Russell," he said, shaking his head in mock pity. "Sitting out here in the freezing cold like a stray dog. Did you forget I changed the locks last night? I told you your mind was slipping." I did not say anything. I just kept my eyes cast downward, letting my shoulders shake violently in the winter wind. Preston pulled out his shiny new key and unlocked my front door. "Come on inside, old man," he commanded, gesturing with his hand. "Let us get this over with so my driver can drop you off at the assisted living facility." I shuffled into my own home, dragging my heavy steel toe boots across the beautiful hardwood floor. My late wife Vivian had picked out that oak flooring 30 years ago. I watched the appraiser, whose name tag read Mr. Vance, wipe his wet shoes right on my expensive Persian rug. He did not even bother to look around the property properly. He walked into my pristine living room, glanced quickly at the solid oak beams and the immaculate plaster walls, and immediately started shaking his head. "This place is a total disaster," Vance said, his voice dripping with heavily rehearsed disappointment. "The foundation is clearly sinking on the west side. The roof probably has severe water damage from the recent storms. The electrical wiring is incredibly outdated and practically a fire hazard." He was lying through his teeth. I had completely renovated the entire house from top to bottom just 5 years ago using the best contractors in the city. The foundation was solid concrete and the wiring was state-of-the-art. Preston stood near the fireplace, warming his hands and pretending to look deeply concerned. "What do you think the property is worth, Vance?" he asked, playing his part in the theatrical scam. Vance scribbled something onto his clipboard, tapping his pen against the paper. Given the severe structural issues, the necessary code violations, and the declining nature of this specific neighborhood, I would say we are looking at $200,000 at the absolute maximum. 200,000. The number was so absurdly low it was almost comical. The land alone without the secret underground water rights was worth triple that amount. Preston was deliberately creating a fraudulent valuation so his own shell company could buy the house for absolute pennies during the conservatorship proceedings. It was a textbook real estate scam designed to steal my generational wealth while completely erasing me from the equation. I knew I needed to push Preston to complete the fraud right there in my living room. I needed his physical signature on those fake documents to secure his federal indictment. So I stepped fully into my role. I walked into the kitchen with a slow, unsteady gait and filled the kettle with water. I carefully prepared 2 cups of hot black tea. I carried the silver serving tray back into the living room, making my hands shake uncontrollably. The porcelain teacups rattled loudly against the saucers. "Oh, Preston," I mumbled, letting my voice sound weak and incredibly raspy. "You are right. I am just so confused lately. I was just thinking about the summer of 1974. Vivian and I went to the lake and the old delivery truck broke down on the highway. I cannot remember how we got home. My head just feels so cloudy today." I walked toward the glass coffee table where Preston had placed the appraisal documents. As I stepped forward, I deliberately let the toe of my heavy boot catch on the thick edge of the rug. I stumbled forward, throwing my weight off balance. The silver tray tilted sharply, and hot tea spilled directly onto the floor, splashing dangerously close to Preston's expensive Italian leather shoes. "Watch it, you crazy old fool!" Preston shouted, jumping back and brushing off his tailored pants. "Look at what you are doing! You are a complete disaster." I immediately dropped to my knees, pulling a rag from my coveralls pocket and began frantically wiping the floor. I apologized over and over again, letting panic fill my voice. "I am sorry. I am so sorry," I babbled, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "My hands just do not work like they used to. I am just so tired." Preston looked down at me, scrubbing the floor like a servant in my own house, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He was completely intoxicated by his own perceived power over me. He thought he had completely broken a man who used to intimidate him. He picked up the remaining intact cup of tea from the tray, took a long, arrogant sip, and placed it back down firmly on the glass coffee table. Then he turned to Vance, the appraiser. "Give me the papers," Preston said, his voice filled with eager greed. "Let us finalize this garbage heap so I can take legal ownership on Friday and bulldoze it." Vance handed him a thick stack of federal appraisal forms and a heavy black fountain pen. Preston did not hesitate for a single second. He leaned over my coffee table right in front of my face and signed his name on the dotted line. He signed his name to a completely fabricated real estate document. He committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal conspiracy, all while drinking my tea and standing in my living room. He smiled a cruel, toothy smile, handing the clipboard back to the sweaty appraiser. "The house is officially valued at $200,000, Preston said, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "The judge will approve the emergency sale by Friday morning. Pack a small bag, Russell. The nursing home van comes for you tomorrow, and you are never coming back here." They walked out of the house laughing together like 2 scavengers who had just stolen a meal. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, locking automatically with a loud metallic click. The sound echoed through the empty hallway. I stayed on my knees for exactly 10 seconds, listening intently to the sound of Preston's luxury engine starting and driving away down the snow-covered street. As soon as the engine noise faded into the distance, the confused old man died forever. I stood up smoothly, my joints perfectly fine and my posture completely straight. I walked over to the front window and watched the street to ensure they were entirely out of sight. Then I walked back to the glass coffee table. I reached into my deep pocket and pulled out a pair of black latex gloves. I snapped them onto my hands, stretching the rubber over my fingers. I carefully picked up the delicate porcelain teacup that Preston had just drank from. His fingerprints were pressed perfectly and permanently into the side of the cup. I placed the teacup into a clear plastic evidence bag and sealed it tight. Preston thought he had just bought a house. He did not realize he had just signed his own prison sentence. I sat in the secure conference room of the Interstate Logistics headquarters located deep in the industrial district of the city. The room was entirely soundproof, encased in thick reinforced glass that overlooked a massive warehouse floor. Below me, hundreds of autonomous forklifts and workers moved pallets of freight. This was the heart of my empire. I had built this company from a single rusted-out delivery truck in 1974. Over 40 years, Vivian and I had quietly acquired shipping routes, distribution centers, and freight contracts until we controlled 30% of the entire East Coast supply chain. I never took the company public. I kept my name off the major corporate registries using a series of holding companies. I wanted to live a quiet life on the South Side. I wanted Maya to grow up valuing hard work instead of inherited wealth, but my humility had only bred her greed. Dawson walked into the conference room holding a secure digital tablet. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, but his eyes were sharp with adrenaline. He placed the tablet on the long mahogany table and slid it toward me. The screen showed a live surveillance feed from a hidden camera our private investigators had managed to plant outside Preston's corporate office. Preston was pacing back and forth in the cold night air outside his building. He was smoking a cigarette, his hands shaking violently. Next to him stood two men in heavy leather jackets. They were the enforcers for the Russian syndicate. Even without audio, the threat was absolutely clear. One of the men stepped forward and poked Preston hard in the chest, backing him up against the brick wall. Preston looked terrified, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The men gave him a final warning and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Preston dropped his cigarette and rubbed his face, his posture completely defeated. "The Russians are losing their patience," Dawson said, standing beside my chair. "Our contacts in the underworld confirmed the meeting. They gave Preston an ultimatum. He has exactly 48 hours to deliver the $50 million he owes them, or they will start breaking bones. They told him they would pay a visit to Maya if he tries to run." I watched the screen as Preston frantically pulled out his phone and started making calls. "He is panicking," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Fear makes men sloppy. What is his next move?" Dawson pulled up a legal document on the tablet. "He is accelerating the conservatorship timeline. Because the Russians threatened his life, Preston just filed an emergency motion with the probate court. He is claiming your mental state has deteriorated so rapidly that you are a physical danger to the community. He bribed a court clerk to push the hearing to this Friday morning. He needs the judge's signature to take control of your estate so he can finalize the sale of the water rights to the city by Monday." I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. "He wants to execute me legally before the Russians execute him physically," I said. "It is time to cut off his escape route. Dawson, initiate the buyout." Dawson nodded and tapped an encrypted application on his device. For the past 24 hours, my proxy agents in New York and London had been quietly opening back channels with the financial brokers who laundered money for the Russian syndicate. Criminal organizations do not care about personal vendettas. They only care about profit and liquidity. If someone offers to buy a bad debt for a premium in clean, untraceable corporate funds, they will take the deal every single time. I had authorized the use of a ghost trust called V Legacy. I named it after Vivian. It was a completely opaque financial entity nested inside offshore accounts, making it impossible for anyone to trace it back to me or Interstate Logistics. Dawson initiated the secure conference call with our lead proxy agent in Manhattan. The agent reported that the Russians were hesitant at first, but when we offered a 10% premium on top of the $50 million principal, their greed overtook their suspicion. The paperwork had been drawn up through dark pool financial channels. All they needed was my final authorization to release the funds. I looked down at the table where the cracked leather ledger from 1985 sat next to the high-tech tablet. I placed my hand on the worn cover, feeling the history of my struggles. I had spent my entire life building wealth to protect my family. Now I was using that same wealth to destroy the man who had corrupted my daughter. "Authorize the transfer," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the large glass room. "Buy the debt. Buy all of it." Dawson pressed the confirmation key. Across the globe, $55 million moved silently through encrypted servers, washing through shell companies before landing safely in the designated offshore accounts of the Russian syndicate. It took less than 3 minutes. "It is done," Mr. Montgomery Dawson said, looking up from the screen. "The Russian syndicate has officially released their claim. They have signed over all promissory notes, collateral agreements, and personal guarantees. V Legacy is now the sole and absolute creditor of Preston's entire corporate structure. You own his debt, you own his company, you own him." A deep, quiet satisfaction settled into my chest. Preston thought he was fighting a helpless old man on the South Side. He had no idea he was completely surrounded. Let us see how he reacts when he realizes his life raft just caught fire, I said. Send the notification. Miles away in his luxurious suburban mansion, Preston was pouring himself a massive glass of scotch. He was standing in his dark kitchen trying to calm his racing heart after the terrifying encounter with the Russian enforcers. He thought he was close to the finish line. He thought the fake appraisal and the accelerated court hearing would save him. Suddenly, his smartphone buzzed loudly on the granite countertop. Our surveillance team monitored the exact moment he received the encrypted email. Preston picked up the phone, his hands still shaking from the alcohol and the stress. He opened the message. It was a formal legal notification from the Russian syndicate's financial front. The message was short and brutally direct. It stated that his debt of $50 million had been completely sold and transferred. The Russian syndicate was no longer involved. He was now legally and financially bound to a new owner. The new owner was listed only as V Legacy Holdings. Preston stared at the screen, his eyes wide with confusion. He quickly scrolled down to read the attached terms of the transfer. The new corporate entity was not offering him an extension. They were not offering a payment plan. The email clearly stated that V Legacy was calling in the entire debt immediately. If he did not surrender all his corporate assets and personal properties by the end of the week, he would be utterly destroyed. He did not know who V Legacy was. He searched the name frantically on his phone, but found absolutely nothing except a blank holding company registered in a tax haven. He had traded a group of violent street thugs for a ruthless anonymous corporate entity that had the power to buy a $50 million debt in cash without breaking a sweat. He was no longer dealing with criminals he could negotiate with. He was dealing with a phantom that had just placed a financial noose around his neck and was slowly pulling it tight. Preston dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered against the kitchen floor, spreading amber liquid and sharp shards across the expensive tiles. He fell to his knees, holding his head in his hands, completely paralyzed by the realization that his nightmare had just become infinitely worse. I watched the report come in on Dawson's screen. The shadow war was entering its final phase. Now it was time to let Preston drag himself into the courtroom where I would deliver the final blow. I sat in the dark living room looking out through the gap in the curtains. The house was completely silent. Preston was definitely experiencing the worst panic of his life right now. He had just received the notification that his entire $50 million debt was bought by an unknown entity named V Legacy. He had no idea who V Legacy was. He certainly did not know that the father-in-law he was trying to put in a nursing home was the one holding the absolute noose around his neck. Panic always leads to fatal mistakes. Preston did not have time to play a slow game of chess anymore. The massive debt was called in immediately. He needed the $100 million land payout from the city not next week but tomorrow. And to do that, he needed to eliminate me completely and as fast as possible. He could not wait for a standard psychological evaluation hearing. He needed a ruthless shortcut. Dawson called me at 5 in the morning. His voice sounded cold and sharp over the secure line. He told me that Preston had just made the most desperate move imaginable. He had transferred a massive sum of money into the offshore account of a psychiatrist named Eris. Eris was not a real doctor. He was a piece of scum in a white coat who provided fake medical certificates to wealthy families who wanted to get rid of their relatives to steal their assets. Dawson informed me that just an hour ago, Eris had filed an emergency medical affidavit with the federal court. In that report, the lying doctor swore under the penalty of perjury that he had personally examined me. He fabricated a story that my mind had completely collapsed. He wrote that I frequently exhibited uncontrollable violent behavior. He claimed that I was prone to lighting fires in the house and that I was in immediate danger to myself and the community. That piece of paper was the only thing Preston needed to bypass the legal system entirely. With a specialist signature, the judge would not need a preliminary hearing. They would sign an emergency medical mandate immediately. That mandate would allow the police and paramedics to break down my door, take away my freedom, and throw me into an isolated psychiatric ward without my consent. Dawson asked me if I wanted him to block the mandate. He had enough power and evidence to call the chief judge and expose Eris that very morning. He could prove that Eris had never set foot in my house and had never seen my face. He could prove the certificate was a blatant forgery built on bribes. But I thought about it in the silence of my dark living room. I looked at the old photographs of Vivian on the mantle. I remembered the cold look in my daughter Maya's eyes at the bistro when she told me to stop being selfish and accept being locked up so she could keep her summer house. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase my humanity. They wanted to turn me into a ghost with no voice. They wanted to strip me of everything that made me a man. No, Dawson. I replied, my voice terrifyingly calm. Let the judge sign the order. I heard Dawson sigh in surprise. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, his voice full of deep concern. "If that order is signed, the police will come to your house. They will handcuff you and put you in the worst mental facility in the city. It is a real danger and a massive humiliation. They treat people like animals in those wards." "I know that," I replied. "But if you stop them now, Preston will only be charged with financial fraud. He will hire expensive lawyers and might only spend a few years in a minimum security luxury prison. I do not want that. I want him to lose everything. I want him and that fake doctor to face the heaviest federal charges possible. If they forcefully take me away, they will be committing kidnapping, illegal deprivation of liberty, and abuse of the federal medical system. Every move they make right now is another nail in their own coffin. Let them feel victorious. When the prey seems to have no escape, that is when the trap snaps shut the hardest." Dawson stayed silent for a long moment and then agreed to follow my orders. He promised to have a covert team monitor the situation closely to ensure I suffered no physical harm when the authorities took me to the ward. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the glass coffee table. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, a 75-year-old black man with deep wrinkles on his forehead. I had been treated unfairly by the police when I was a poor young man on these very streets back in the 60s. I knew exactly what it felt like to have my human rights stripped away by men in uniforms. I knew the fear of being helpless in the back of a squad car. But this time I was not a victim. This time I was the one holding the script. I was the architect of my own capture. I took off my heavy gold watch and hid it in a secret compartment under the floorboards. I put my dirty, grease-stained mechanic clothes back on. I needed to look exactly like the man Preston described in his fake medical report. A confused, poor, and senile old man who could not care for himself. I took a microscopic memory card that contained all the encryption keys for my massive wealth and the entire interstate logistics network. I hid the card deep inside the thick lining of my old work boot. This tiny piece of plastic was the key that would decide the ultimate fate of Preston. I was taking it with me straight into the hell he prepared for me. I went down to the kitchen and made a simple cup of black coffee. I sat in the old armchair by the front window. I did not turn on the lights. I just sat in the quiet winter morning drinking my bitter coffee and waiting for the storm to arrive. The sky outside was a bleak gray reflecting the coldness in my heart. I thought about the empire I had built and how it all came down to this single room. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the absolute silence of the neighborhood was torn apart. From a distance, piercing sounds began to echo down the street. Blaring sirens ripped through the freezing morning air. At first it was just a faint noise, but it quickly grew louder and much more aggressive. Bright red and blue lights flashed wildly, reflecting off the snow-covered windows of my neighbors' houses. 2 police patrol cars slammed on their brakes right in front of my house. Their heavy tires slid on the thick winter snow. Right behind them was a large white ambulance from the Federal Psychiatric Department. Massive paramedics stepped out holding thick leather restraints and heavy sedatives. They were not here to help a sick old man. They were here to capture a dangerous animal. And parked right across the street, hidden behind a large oak tree, was Preston's silver sports car. He was sitting inside with his face pressed tightly against the glass. His eyes were shining with absolute triumph and greedy anticipation. He was waiting to watch the final act of the play he directed. He was waiting to see his father-in-law dragged out of the house in cuffs so he could walk in and take everything I owned. Heavy footsteps stomped up my wooden porch. The sound echoed through the empty living room. A deafening knock shook the front walls of my home. A rough, commanding voice demanded that I open the door immediately, stating they had a court order for my immediate removal. I finished the last drop of my coffee and put the empty cup on the table. I smoothed out the wrinkles on my mechanic uniform, took a deep breath, and stood up tall. It was time for the show to begin. The police were standing at my door, ready to strip away my rights. But they did not know they were just pawns willingly stepping onto a chessboard that I had entirely rigged. The knocking grew louder, signaling that the final battle had truly arrived. The heavy pounding on my front door vibrated through the floorboards. I did not move from my armchair. I just watched the thick oak door shudder under the weight of the police officers outside. A loud voice ordered me to open up or they would breach. I took a slow, deep breath and let the silence of the house answer them. 10 seconds later, a massive crash echoed through the hallway. The door frame splintered into pieces. The heavy wood swung open, hitting the wall with a violent thud. Cold winter air rushed into my living room, carrying the snow and the noise of the sirens. 3 police officers stormed into the house. They had their hands resting on their duty belts, looking around nervously as if they expected an ambush. Following right behind them were two massive paramedics carrying a heavy canvas stretcher and leather restraints. They all stopped when they saw me. I was just an old black man in dirty mechanic coveralls sitting quietly by the window with an empty coffee cup on the table next to me. I did not look like the violently unstable monster Preston had described in the fake medical report. One of the officers stepped forward. He looked at a piece of paper in his hand and then looked at me. He stated my full name and told me they had an emergency medical mandate from the federal court. He said I was deemed a danger to myself and others. He told me I had to come with them to the state psychiatric facility immediately. He warned me that if I resisted, they would use force and tranquilizers to subdue me. I looked at the young officer. He was just doing his job following a piece of paper signed by a corrupt judge and a fake doctor. I slowly stood up from my chair and raised my hands in the air. I told him I would not fight. I told him I was ready to go. The officer looked surprised. Usually people kick and scream when they are dragged out of their homes, but I just turned around and placed my hands behind my back. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicked tightly around my wrists. The sound was sharp and metallic. It was a sound designed to strip away your dignity and remind you that you are no longer a free man. The paramedics stepped back, realizing they would not need the heavy leather straps today. The officers grabbed my arms and began to march me out of my own home. We walked out onto the front porch. The freezing wind hit my face immediately. The red and blue lights from the patrol cars flashed brightly, illuminating the snow-covered street. My neighbors had stepped out of their houses and were standing on their porches, wrapping their coats tightly around themselves. They watched in silent shock as the old mechanic they had known for decades was led away in chains like a common criminal. I kept my head held high. I did not look down. I wanted them to remember this exact moment when the truth finally came to light. Across the street, the door of the silver sports car opened. Preston stepped out into the snow. He was wearing a long cashmere coat, looking every bit the wealthy, concerned son-in-law. He walked across the icy street with a perfectly rehearsed expression of deep sorrow on his face. He approached the police officers as they were guiding me toward the back of the cruiser. Preston stopped the lead officer and placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. He thanked the officer for handling the situation with care. He lied perfectly, saying how hard this was for his family and how much it broke his heart to see my mind deteriorate this way. The officer nodded sympathetically and told Preston they would make sure I arrived at the facility safely. Then Preston turned his gaze to me. The fake sadness in his eyes vanished the second the police officer looked away to open the door of the cruiser. Preston stepped extremely close to me, invading my personal space. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore mixed with the bitter scent of his own nervous sweat. He leaned down so his mouth was right next to my ear. His voice was a barely audible whisper filled with absolute malice and triumphant greed. "Enjoy the oatmeal, old man," he whispered. "Have fun rotting in that padded room. I am calling the demolition crew tomorrow morning. Your house is mine." He pulled back and gave me a pathetic look of fake pity for the benefit of the watching neighbors. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg him to stop. He wanted the police to see me have a mental breakdown right there in the snow to completely validate the fake medical report. Instead, I turned my head slowly and looked him dead in the eyes. I did not frown. I did not yell. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was not the smile of a confused old man. It was the smile of a predator watching a rat walk perfectly into a trap. Preston saw that smile, and his fake expression of pity instantly shattered. A flicker of genuine confusion and deep primal fear crossed his eyes. He realized in that split second that I was not afraid. He realized that I had surrendered on purpose, but he was too arrogant to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The officer pushed my head down gently and guided me into the back seat of the freezing police cruiser. The heavy plastic seats were hard and uncomfortable. The heavy metal door slammed shut, locking me inside the cage. The sound of the door closing was the final act of Preston's elaborate theft. Through the thick plexiglass window, I kept my eyes locked directly on Preston. He was standing on the curb watching the police car with a look of growing unease on his face. He rubbed the back of his neck, shivering in the cold. My chilling smile never left my face. I shifted my weight on the hard plastic seat. I brought my cuffed hands down as low as I could behind my back. I used the toe of my left boot to push down on the heel of my right boot. With a quiet snap, the hidden compartment in the sole opened slightly. I wiggled my fingers down into the cuff of my heavy work pants and felt the microscopic encrypted flash drive. I let it drop silently into the hidden compartment of the shoe before clicking the heel back into place. That tiny piece of plastic held the absolute destruction of Preston's entire life. It held the bank records, the shell company ownership files, and the exact proof of his $50 million debt to V Legacy. I was carrying the weapon that would execute him right into the federal psychiatric ward. The police cruiser shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. The sirens wailed loudly as we drove down the snowy street, leaving my home behind. I watched Preston shrink in the rearview mirror until he was nothing but a speck in the distance. He thought he had just won the war. He did not know I had just locked the doors of his tomb. The ride to the state psychiatric facility felt like a descent into the underworld. The police cruiser bumped along the poorly paved roads of the city outskirts until we reached a massive concrete building surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. It looked exactly like a prison because, for all intents and purposes, it was one. The officers handed me over to the ward staff in a sterile intake room that smelled heavily of cheap bleach and stale sweat. A heavily built nurse with dead eyes processed my paperwork. She did not speak to me. She spoke about me to the guards as if I were a piece of defective furniture. 2 orderlies grabbed my arms and led me down a long corridor with flickering fluorescent lights. The screams and mutters of the forgotten souls locked behind heavy steel doors echoed through the hallway. They took me into a small concrete room and ordered me to strip. I complied silently. They took away my dirty mechanic coveralls. They took my heavy winter coat. But when they reached for my boots, I played the part of the fragile old man. I let my hands shake and begged them to let me keep my shoes because my feet were freezing. The orderlies looked at my worn-out boots with disgust and decided they were not worth the effort of confiscating. They tossed me a set of thin paper scrubs and locked the heavy metal door behind me. I was completely alone in the isolation cell. There was no bed. There was only a thin plastic mattress on the concrete floor and a metal toilet in the corner. The cold seeped through the paper scrubs instantly. Preston wanted me to break in here. He wanted the isolation and the degradation to shatter my mind so I would truly become the helpless victim he needed me to be. But my mind was a fortress. I had survived the brutal winters of Chicago sleeping in the cab of a broken-down truck. This concrete box was nothing. I waited for hours in the dark. I tracked the time by listening to the changing footsteps of the guards in the hallway. When the heavy boots of the day shift were replaced by the lazy, shuffling steps of the night shift, I knew it was time to move. I walked over to the small reinforced glass window and the heavy steel door. I peered out into the dim hallway. A young orderly was sitting at a metal desk at the end of the block. He was tapping his fingers anxiously on the table, looking constantly at his cheap wristwatch. I knew that look. It was the look of a man drowning in debt. It was the look of a man who desperately needed a way out. I tapped the glass twice. The orderly looked up annoyed. He stood up and walked over to my door, ready to yell at me to go to sleep. But before he could speak, I held my hand up to the glass. I had popped open the hidden compartment in my left boot. The right boot held the encrypted flash drive, but the left boot held something far more universally understood. It was a solid 1-ounce South African gold coin. I had kept it hidden on me for decades for absolute emergencies. The pure gold caught the dim light of the hallway and gleamed through the reinforced window. The orderly stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened. He looked around the empty hallway, checking the blind spots of the security cameras. He stepped right up to the door and pressed his face against the glass. I spoke quietly through the small air vent at the bottom of the door. I told him I needed a burner phone with a clean line. I told him the gold coin was worth over $2,000 in untraceable cash. I promised him the coin the second he dropped the phone through the meal slot. He did not hesitate. The greed in his eyes overpowered his fear of the hospital administration. He nodded quickly and walked away. 10 minutes later, he returned holding a small, cheap plastic mobile phone. He slid the metal meal slot open just enough to push the phone through. I slipped the heavy gold coin into his waiting hand. The metal slot slammed shut, and he hurried back to his desk. I sat down on the thin plastic mattress and powered on the device. The bright screen illuminated the dark concrete cell. I dialed the secure number from memory. Dawson answered immediately. He had been waiting for my call. I told Dawson I was inside and secure. I asked him for an update on Preston's movements. Dawson informed me that Preston was currently at an upscale steakhouse celebrating his false victory with his corrupt lawyers. He was finalizing the legal paperwork to sell my property to the city planners on Monday. He thought he had completely won. He thought he had erased his $50 million debt and secured his future. I looked at the peeling paint on the concrete wall of my cell. It is time, I said, my voice low and completely devoid of mercy. Execute the financial freeze. V. Legacy is calling in the debt right now. Dawson confirmed the order and hung up. I sat in the dark cell, picturing the absolute chaos that was about to unfold across the city. Miles away in the warm, luxurious dining room of the steakhouse, Preston was laughing loudly. He raised a glass of expensive champagne to toast his lawyers. The waiter approached the table carrying the leather checkbook holding a bill for over $3,000. Preston smugly pulled out his exclusive black credit card and handed it to the waiter without even looking at the total. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned in and whispered to Preston that the card had been declined. Preston scoffed, acting annoyed by the bank's supposed mistake. He pulled out another platinum card from a different bank and tossed it on the table. The waiter walked away but returned moments later with the manager. The manager politely informed Preston that every single card connected to his name and his corporate accounts was showing a hard, systemic freeze. Not just declined, but completely locked by a supreme creditor. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly. His blood ran cold. He grabbed his smartphone and opened his banking applications. Every single screen flashed red. His personal checking accounts were zeroed out. His corporate expense accounts were locked. His offshore emergency funds were inaccessible. V Legacy had exercised its absolute right as the primary debt holder to freeze all of his assets pending immediate repayment of the $50 million. He was suddenly sitting in a high-end restaurant with a massive bill and absolutely no way to pay it. The lawyers sitting at his table watched his face turn pale. They immediately realized something was horribly wrong. The illusion of his wealth evaporated in a matter of seconds. Preston excused himself and ran to the restaurant bathroom. He splashed water on his face, breathing heavily. He was completely broke. V Legacy had cut off his oxygen. He realized with terrifying clarity that the Russian syndicate was no longer his biggest problem. This anonymous corporate ghost was systematically destroying him. He knew he had only one play left: the $100 million water rights deal with the city. If he could just get his hands on the deed to my house, he could sell the land, pay off V Legacy, and disappear. But the city required my signature to release the emergency funds before the final court hearing on Friday. He could not wait for the judge anymore. He needed me to sign a legal deed right now tonight. But he could not go to the psychiatric ward himself. The doctors would not let him near me after he filed a report claiming I was violently unstable around him. He needed someone else. Someone I trusted. Someone who could walk into the facility and manipulate me into signing away my life. Preston pulled out his phone and called Maya. He did not tell her the truth about his bankruptcy. He lied frantically, telling her that the bank needed a secondary signature from me to secure her summer house. He told her to drive to the psychiatric ward immediately. He ordered her to go into the isolation cell and force her broken father to sign the papers no matter what it took. The final confrontation was coming directly to my locked door. The heavy metal door of my isolation cell echoed loudly as the lock turned. The night shift orderly, the one who had taken my gold coins, stood in the doorway. He nodded silently and gestured for me to follow him. I walked out of the concrete box, my bare feet freezing against the cold linoleum floor of the psychiatric ward. The orderly led me down a maze of dimly lit corridors. The screams of the other patients had died down to low, miserable moans. The air smelled of strong industrial bleach and stale despair. I knew exactly where we were going and who was waiting for me. Before we reached the end of the hallway, I reached into the waistband of my thin paper scrubs. My fingers brushed against the cheap plastic burner phone I had bought earlier. I pressed the small button on the side to wake the screen. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the bright red circle. The timer started ticking. I slid the phone back into my waistband, making sure the microphone was not covered. I was ready. The orderly opened the door to the visitor's room. It was a bleak, rectangular space. There were no windows. The walls were painted a sickening shade of pale green. In the center of the room was a heavy metal table bolted directly to the concrete floor with two metal chairs bolted opposite each other. Sitting in one of those chairs was my daughter Maya. She looked completely out of place in this grim nightmare. She was wearing a thick designer wool coat and a silk scarf. Her expensive leather handbag rested on the dirty metal table. She looked around the room with an expression of profound disgust, wrinkling her nose at the smell of the facility. When I walked into the room, she did not stand up. She did not rush over to hug her father. She did not ask if I was hurt or if I was cold or if I was frightened. She just looked at my paper scrubs and let out a long, annoyed sigh. The orderly stepped out of the room and closed the heavy door behind him, leaving us completely alone. I slowly walked over to the empty metal chair and sat down facing her. The cold metal sent a shiver up my spine. Maya did not waste time with fake pleasantries. She reached into her luxury handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She placed them on the table and pushed them across the cold metal surface until they rested right in front of me. She placed a heavy gold pen right on top of the paper. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the very top were perfectly clear. Quitclaim deed. It was a legal instrument used to immediately transfer all ownership of a property to another person, abandoning all rights and claims. "Preston needs you to sign this right now, Dad," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "The conservatorship hearing is taking too long. He needs the house transferred to his holding company by tomorrow morning." I kept my hands resting flat on my lap. I did not reach for the pen. I just stared at the woman sitting across from me. She was my flesh and blood, but I felt no connection to her anymore. The little girl I used to carry on my shoulders was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who worshipped money above all else. "And why would I sign away the home I built with your mother?" I asked, my voice steady and quiet. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Because we are offering you a deal," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Preston and I have found a very exclusive luxury retirement community in the northern suburbs. They have private rooms, beautifully landscaped gardens, and around-the-clock medical staff who treat the residents like royalty. It costs $10,000 a month. If you pick up that pen and sign this deed right now, I will personally make sure you are transferred out of this hellhole tonight. You will spend the rest of your life in absolute comfort." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then her expression darkened into a mask of pure cruelty. "But if you refuse to sign," she continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I will tell the doctors that you attacked me during this visit. I will tell them you are completely out of your mind and violently dangerous. Preston will ensure the judge locks you in this exact concrete box for the rest of your natural life. You will never see the sun again. You will eat terrible food, you will sleep on the floor, and you will die in this terrible place surrounded by crazy people. Do not be stupid, Dad. Sign the paper." It was pure textbook extortion. She was holding my freedom, my dignity, and my life hostage in exchange for a piece of real estate. She was threatening to bury her own father alive. I looked at the gold pen resting on the document, then I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I needed to know the absolute truth before I pulled the trigger on her life. I needed to know there was no misunderstanding. "Maya," I said, keeping my voice low, "do you actually know what Preston is doing? Do you know that his tech company is a massive fraud? Do you know that he owes $50 million to a criminal syndicate and that he is completely broke?" Maya did not flinch. She did not look surprised. She just rolled her eyes impatiently. "Of course I know, Dad," she snapped. "Preston tells me everything. The market turned against us. It happens to successful people all the time." "And the house," I continued, pressing her further. "Do you know why he wants my specific house on the south side? Do you know about the Secret City infrastructure project? Do you know he is trying to sell the water rights under my land for $100 million? She slammed her hand down on the metal table. "Yes, I know," she shouted, her perfectly manicured face twisting in anger. "I know about the $100 million, and we need it. You are a 75-year-old retired mechanic. What are you possibly going to do with that kind of money? You do not travel. You do not buy nice things. You just sit in that dusty old house living in the past. Preston and I have a reputation to maintain. We have investors to appease. We have the summer house in the Hamptons. That money belongs in our hands where it can actually be used to maintain our lifestyle." She admitted to everything. She admitted to the fraud. She admitted to the theft. She admitted that my life was worth less to her than a summer house. The absolute totality of her betrayal echoed perfectly in the small concrete room. Every word she spoke was a nail in her own coffin. "You are willing to destroy me for money?" I asked one final time, giving her the very last chance to show a single ounce of human decency. "You destroyed yourself by being so incredibly stubborn," she sneered, crossing her arms over her expensive coat. "Now pick up the pen and sign the damn paper so I can get out of this disgusting place. My driver is waiting outside." I looked at her for a long, silent moment. The heartbreak I thought I would feel was completely absent. There was only a cold, mechanical emptiness left inside me. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen. Maya smiled a triumphant, greedy smile, thinking she had finally broken me. But I did not move the pen toward the paper. I placed the pen back down on the table. I placed my calloused hand on the thick stack of legal documents. With a swift, deliberate motion, I slid the documents back across the cold metal table. They hit the edge and spilled onto the dirty linoleum floor, scattering everywhere. "I will not sign anything," I said, my voice booming with a sudden, terrifying authority that made her physically jump back in her chair. "You and Preston will not get a single dime from my estate." Maya's face turned bright red with absolute fury. She stood up so fast her metal chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. "You crazy old fool," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "You are going to die in here. Do you hear me? You are going to rot in this cell. I am never coming back for you. You are dead to me." She snatched her luxury handbag off the table and stormed toward the heavy metal door. She pounded her fist against the small reinforced window, signaling the orderly to let her out. The door opened, and she marched out into the hallway, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the floor. She did not look back. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, the lock engaging with a loud metallic thud. I was alone again in the bleak visitor's room, but I was not defeated. I slowly stood up from the metal chair. I reached into the waistband of my paper scrubs and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. The voice recording application was still running. The timer was steadily ticking upward. The microphone had picked up every single word, every threat, every admission of guilt, every detail of the extortion attempt. I pressed the red button to stop the recording. I tapped the screen and attached the audio file to a secure encrypted message. I typed a single sentence to Dawson. "The trap is full." I pressed send. The message vanished into the digital ether, flying straight to Dawson's secure server. Maya thought she had just sentenced me to death in a concrete box. She had no idea she had just handed me the exact federal evidence I needed to put her and her husband in a real prison for the next 20 years. The game of shadows was over. It was time to bring the war into the light. The freezing rain poured down on the dark streets of Chicago. Preston sat in the back of a black luxury vehicle parked in a dark alley behind the federal courthouse. He was sweating heavily despite the cold air pouring through the cracked window. Sitting across from him was Judge Gallagher. The judge was a man who built his entire judicial career on taking bribes from desperate men. Preston reached into his designer bag and pulled out a thick brown envelope. He handed it across the leather seat with trembling hands. Inside was $200,000 in untraceable cash. It was the absolute last bit of money Preston had left from his hidden emergency offshore fund. He looked at the judge with wild, desperate eyes. He told the judge that he needed the conservatorship ruling signed and finalized by 9 o'clock on Friday morning. He explained that his father-in-law was completely insane and needed to be institutionalized permanently so the estate could be liquidated. Judge Gallagher weighed the heavy envelope in his hands and smiled a sickeningly greedy smile. He promised Preston that the hearing would be a mere formality. He guaranteed that I would be legally erased before lunchtime. Preston finally breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he had successfully bought his way out of hell. He thought the Russian mob and the Phantom V legacy would be paid off by Monday afternoon. He did not know that the judge he just bribed was about to be dragged down into the abyss right alongside him. Across the city in a high-rise office tower, Dawson was standing in front of a massive glass window overlooking the skyline. He was not sleeping tonight. He was marshaling the forces of war. On his polished mahogany desk lay 3 perfectly organized physical folders. These folders were the heavy artillery that would annihilate Preston's entire existence. The first folder contained the audio recording I had captured on the burner phone inside the psychiatric ward. Dawson had his elite audio forensic team clean up the digital file until Maya's voice was crystal clear. Every cruel threat she made was amplified. Every admission of financial fraud and extortion was documented and transcribed. The second folder contained the absolute proof of perjury. Dawson private investigators had hacked directly into the offshore bank accounts of Dr. Aris. They found the exact wire transfers Preston had sent to buy the fake medical evaluation. They even found text messages where Aris admitted to his associates that he had never seen me in person. The third folder was the most devastating weapon of all. It contained the absolute corporate ownership documents of V Legacy. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the phantom entity holding Preston $50 million debt. The legal trap was meticulously assembled. All Dawson needed now was the man who would drop the guillotine. Inside the grim isolation cell of the state psychiatric ward, I sat quietly on the thin plastic mattress. It was late Thursday night. Tomorrow was the day of the final hearing. I had spent 2 days in this freezing concrete box eating cold food and listening to the cries of broken men. Preston thought the isolation was slowly destroying my mind. He thought I was trapped behind locked steel doors and forgotten by the world. But those heavy doors were only locked because I allowed them to be. I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At exactly midnight, the heavy deadbolt on my cell door turned with a loud mechanical clank. The door swung open, but it was not the night shift orderly standing there. It was Dr. Sterling, the chief medical director of the entire state hospital network. He was wearing a highly expensive suit, but his face was completely pale. He was sweating profusely and trembling as he looked at me sitting on the floor in my cheap paper scrubs. He did not look at me like a patient. He looked at me like a terrifying king who had just conquered his kingdom. 2 days ago, while Preston was busy bribing a federal judge, my proxy agents at V Legacy made a quiet corporate acquisition. We bought the massive private medical supply company that funded this entire hospital network. We bought the building outright. We bought the administration board. We bought Dr. Sterling's entire career. I was no longer a helpless ward of the state. I was the absolute owner of the ground he was currently standing on. Dr. Sterling stepped into the dirty cell and bowed his head in deep submission. He apologized profusely for the terrible conditions of the room. He told me that my private town car was waiting at the secure rear exit. He begged me not to fire him for the way the orderlies had treated me. I did not say a single word to him. I slowly stood up from the floor, dropping the cheap paper scrubs onto the dirty mattress. I put on my own clothes and walked out of the cell. I walked down the long, dark corridor with heavy, purposeful steps. The nurses and security guards stood frozen against the walls, watching in absolute shock as the hospital director personally escorted a supposedly insane patient out the front doors. The orderly who took my gold coin looked like he had seen a ghost. They all bowed their heads in fear as I passed by. I walked out the heavy glass doors and stepped into the freezing night air as a completely free man. The sleek black Phantom town car was idling by the curb. Dawson was standing by the open door holding a long black garment bag. He bowed his head respectfully as I approached. I climbed into the warm, luxurious interior of the vehicle. Dawson sat across from me and handed me a crystal glass of aged whiskey. I took a slow sip, letting the fire burn down my throat. The taste of victory was already lingering in the air. We drove in silence to my secure penthouse suite in the downtown district. It was a massive property that Preston and Maya had no idea existed. I walked into the expansive master bathroom and turned on the hot water. I stood under the scalding spray for a long time. I washed away the horrible smell of the psychiatric ward. I washed away the dirt and the grease of the mechanic coveralls I had worn for the past 3 days. I watched the dark water swirl down the drain, taking the persona of the helpless old man with it. That fragile father was dead, and he was never coming back. I walked into the master bedroom where Dawson had carefully laid out the contents of the garment bag on the bed. It was not my Sunday church suit. It was not my worn-out work clothes. It was a bespoke Italian suit tailored perfectly to my exact measurements. It was made of the absolute finest dark charcoal wool. It cost over $10,000. I had not worn this specific suit since my most ruthless corporate days when I was taking over rival shipping companies in the 90s. It was not just clothing. It was the armor of a billionaire predator preparing for a massacre. I put on the crisp white shirt. I tied the heavy silk tie with precise mechanical movements. I slipped into the tailored jacket, feeling the weight of the expensive fabric settle perfectly on my broad shoulders. I slid my feet into polished leather shoes. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The tired father who had wept in a diner was completely gone. The old mechanic who spilled tea on a rug was dead and buried. Standing in the mirror was the shadow founder of Interstate Logistics. I was the corporate ghost who owned Preston's entire life. I checked my heavy gold watch. The sun was just starting to rise over the Chicago skyline on Friday morning. It was time to go to court. It was time to show my daughter and her husband exactly who they had decided to betray. The morning sun reflected off the icy steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. Preston and Maya stepped out of their sleek silver sports car. They walked up the concrete stairs looking exactly like royalty. Maya was wearing a stunning white designer dress that contrasted sharply with the bleak winter morning. She wore a string of pearls around her neck and held her head incredibly high. She did not look like a woman who had just condemned her father to rot in a concrete cell. She looked like a woman who was about to inherit a fortune and spend it all before the weekend was over. Preston walked beside her wearing his finest custom-tailored suit. His hair was perfectly styled and his expensive leather shoes clicked loudly on the stone steps. He carried himself with the absolute arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire world. He thought his $50 million debt to the Russian syndicate was a problem of the past. He thought the phantom entity known as V Legacy could simply be paid off with the money he was about to steal from me. He had no idea that the phantom he was desperately running from was the very man he was trying to bury. Walking slightly ahead of them was Preston, arrogant defense attorney. The lawyer was a slick man with a fake tan and a smile that looked like a hungry predator showing its teeth. He carried a very thin leather briefcase. He did not bring boxes of evidence or stacks of legal precedents. He did not need them. He knew the judge had been completely bought and paid for the night before. He thought he was walking into an empty courtroom to steamroll an absent old man. He thought he would read a few sad paragraphs about my failing mental health and walk out with a massive legal victory and a hefty percentage of my estate. The three of them pushed through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. They walked down the long marble corridor toward courtroom number 7. Preston grabbed Maya's hand and squeezed it tightly, giving her a reassuring smile. They whispered to each other about the luxury vacation they were going to book the second the judge signed the papers. They reached the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The lawyer pushed them open and strode confidently inside, expecting to see an empty gallery and a bored court clerk waiting for them. But the courtroom was not empty. It was completely packed. Preston stopped dead in his tracks the moment he stepped inside. Maya let out a small gasp of surprise. The wooden benches of the gallery, which were usually empty for these mundane probate hearings, were filled to absolute capacity. Every single seat was taken. Sitting in perfect silence were dozens of men and women dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits. They sat with perfect posture. They did not whisper to each other. They did not look at their phones. They radiated an aura of immense wealth and absolute terrifying power. These were not ordinary citizens. These were the absolute titans of the transportation industry. This was the Supreme Board of Directors for Interstate Logistics. They were the men and women who controlled 30% of the freight on the entire East Coast. And they had all flown into Chicago on private jets this morning for one single reason. They were here to watch their shadow founder and chairman utterly destroy the boy who tried to steal from him. Preston did not recognize a single face in the crowd. He was a fake tech executive who played with shell companies and stolen money. He had never been in the presence of true generational power. He leaned close to his lawyer and whispered frantically, asking who all these intimidating people were. The lawyer looked around nervously, adjusting his silk tie. He had no idea. Then Preston's arrogant ego filled the gap in his logic. A wide, greedy smile spread across his face. He leaned down and whispered into Maya's ear. He told her these must be the municipal planners and the high-level city executives. He assumed the city council had sent their top representatives to witness the official transfer of the deed because the subterranean water rights were so incredibly valuable to the state infrastructure. He thought these powerful people were here to validate his brilliance. He thought they were here to hand him his $100 million payout. His chest puffed out with intense pride. He walked past the silent board of directors, feeling like a conquering king accepting the absolute surrender of his enemies. Preston and Maya took their seats at the plaintiff's table. The slick lawyer sat next to them, organizing his two pathetic pieces of paper. The table on the other side of the aisle, the defense table, was completely empty. There was no lawyer representing me. There was no family member standing by my side. To Preston, it looked like the perfect, flawless victory. He leaned back in his wooden chair, completely relaxed. A heavy wooden door behind the bench opened and the bailiff instructed the courtroom to rise. Judge Gallagher walked in. He was wearing his long black robes, looking incredibly serious and deeply authoritative. But as he sat down, his eyes immediately darted toward Preston. The judge gave a microscopic nod. It was a silent confirmation that the $200,000 bribe had been securely received and the fix was officially in. Judge Gallagher looked out at the packed gallery. He seemed slightly unnerved by the silent, intimidating men in dark suits, but he quickly recovered his composure. He picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sound block. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the large room. He announced the case number and stated that they were here to rule on an emergency petition for permanent conservatorship. He looked down at Preston's lawyer and asked him to present his opening statement for the court record. The slick lawyer stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, putting on a masterful performance of fake sympathy. He spoke about the tragic and rapid decline of the human mind. He spoke about how difficult it was for a loving daughter to watch her father lose his grip on reality and forget his own name. He told the judge that I was currently secured in a state psychiatric facility because I had become violently unstable and entirely incapable of managing my own life or my own assets. He pointed to the empty defense table as proof of my absolute isolation. He formally requested that Preston be granted absolute immediate control over my entire estate for my own physical and financial protection. Preston sat at the table trying to look heartbroken. Maya kept her eyes cast downward, playing the role of the grieving daughter perfectly. She wiped a fake tear from her cheek. Judge Gallagher nodded slowly, pretending to carefully consider the fabricated tragic story. He picked up his heavy gold pen and moved it toward the final signature line on the legal decree. He asked the courtroom clerk if there was any legal representation present for the defendant, just to satisfy the procedural requirements. The lawyer laughed a soft, arrogant laugh. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the defendant is currently locked in an isolation ward. He has no legal representation because he does not even know what day it is. We request you sign the order immediately so my clients can begin managing his medical care and securing his properties." The judge nodded and pressed the tip of his pen to the paper. The massive theft was exactly 1 second away from being permanently finalized. Suddenly, the court bailiff pressed his hand to his earpiece, listening to a frantic message from the security checkpoint downstairs. The bailiff's face turned completely pale. He stepped forward quickly and raised his voice, interrupting the judge mid-signature. "Your Honor," the bailiff announced, his voice shaking slightly over the microphone. "The defendant has arrived." The heavy wooden doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a massive echoing crash. The sound was so loud and sudden that it completely silenced the entire room. Every single head turned toward the back. The arrogant smirk vanished from the face of the slick defense attorney. Maya stopped pretending to cry and spun around in her wooden chair. Preston let out a short breath and finally looked back. Judge Gallagher lowered his pen and stared in absolute shock. I stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the bright light of the courtroom. I was not wearing the dirty mechanic coveralls they had seen me in just 3 days ago. I was not wearing the cheap paper scrubs from the psychiatric isolation cell. I was wearing the bespoke $10,000 charcoal Italian suit. The fabric fell perfectly across my broad shoulders. My posture was completely straight. I walked with the slow, measured, heavy steps of a man who owned the entire building. The vulnerable, fragile old man they thought they had broken was completely gone. I was the shadow founder of Interstate Logistics, and I was walking into the room to execute a hostile takeover of my own life. But I was not walking alone. Flanking me on my right was Dawson. He was holding the thick leather folder that contained the absolute destruction of every person at the plaintiff's table. Flanking me on my left were 2 other men. They were not just ordinary lawyers. They were former federal prosecutors who had spent decades putting corrupt politicians and mob bosses into maximum security prisons. They walked with terrifying precision. They wore impeccable dark suits, and their expressions were entirely made of stone. The 3 men walked slightly behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of legal power. We walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. The silence in the large room was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic click of our polished leather shoes hitting the marble floor. As I walked past the wooden benches of the gallery, the men and women in the dark suits stood up. My board of directors rose to their feet in absolute unison. They stood in silent respect for their chairman. They did not say a word, but the message was perfectly clear. They were my army, and they were ready for war. Preston watched the gallery stand up. His brain could not process what he was seeing. He had assumed these wealthy people were city officials waiting for his land deal. But now they were standing up in deep respect for the crazy old man he had just tried to lock away. Preston swallowed hard. His face grew slightly pale. He quickly averted his gaze, looking down at the wooden table. He suddenly could not bring himself to look me in the eye. A cold, deep dread began to form in the pit of his stomach. He did not know why, but he knew something was horribly wrong. Maya, on the other hand, was completely blinded by her own arrogance. She looked at me walking down the aisle in my expensive suit, and she actually laughed out loud. Her mocking laughter echoed sharply in the quiet courtroom. She leaned over to Preston and whispered loudly enough for the front rows to hear. She told him I must have rented the suit. She sneered at Dawson and the 2 federal prosecutors. She called them cheap mall lawyers. She thought I had hired some desperate public defenders from a local strip mall to try and fight a lost cause. She honestly believed that the men walking beside me were amateurs. She had no idea she was mocking the most dangerous legal team in the entire state of Illinois. I did not even look at her. I did not give her the satisfaction of my anger. I walked right past their table and took my seat at the empty defense desk. I sat down slowly and buttoned my suit jacket. Dawson stood right next to me while the two federal prosecutors stood like statues behind my chair. The slick lawyer representing Preston tried to regain his composure. He puffed out his chest and looked up at the judge. He demanded that the court proceed with the ruling. He stated that my unexpected appearance did not change the medical facts. He confidently reminded the judge about the fake medical affidavit signed by Dr. Aris. He smugly asked Judge Gallagher to sign the conservatorship decree and have the bailiffs escort me back to the psychiatric ward. Judge Gallagher picked up his heavy gold pen again. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. He cleared his throat and prepared to dismiss me. He told the courtroom that the medical evidence was overwhelming and that my physical presence here today was a clear violation of a federal medical mandate. He was about to order the armed bailiffs to arrest me right there in the courtroom. Dawson stepped forward. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply walked right up to the wooden barrier separating the tables from the bench. He held up the thick leather folder. He looked Judge Gallagher dead in the eyes and spoke with a voice that commanded absolute, terrifying authority. "Your Honor," Dawson said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "The defense submits new evidence directly to the bench. This evidence requires your immediate personal review before any further action is taken in this room." The arrogant lawyer scoffed loudly. He objected, telling the judge that the evidentiary period was closed. He said no cheap mall lawyer could introduce random documents at the final hearing. Judge Gallagher held up his hand to silence the lawyer. The judge felt untouchable. He had $200,000 in cash sitting in his offshore account. He believed he was completely immune to whatever trick my lawyers were trying to pull. He gestured lazily for the bailiff to bring him the folder. He thought it was just a pathetic, desperate plea from an old man begging to keep his house. The bailiff took the heavy leather folder from Dawson and handed it up to the high wooden bench. Judge Gallagher took it with a sigh of extreme boredom. He flipped open the heavy cover. He looked down at the first piece of paper. The reaction was instantaneous. The blood drained entirely from Judge Gallagher's face. His skin turned the color of pale chalk. He stopped breathing. The arrogant, bored expression was wiped away, completely replaced by an expression of pure, absolute terror. His eyes widened to an impossible size as they darted frantically across the page. He tried to pick up the paper, but his hands began to shake. They shook violently. The paper rattled against the wooden desk. He dropped his heavy gold pen. It rolled off the edge of the bench and hit the floor with a loud, sharp clatter. The sound made Preston jump in his seat. Judge Gallagher leaned forward, gripping the edges of the folder as if the floor beneath him was collapsing. He stared at the documents with unblinking, horrified eyes. He slowly leaned into the small black microphone sitting on his desk. His voice was no longer authoritative. It was weak and completely broken. "Is this really happening?" he whispered into the microphone. The whisper echoed through the silent courtroom. Maya stopped smiling. Her mocking laughter died instantly. Preston felt the cold dread in his stomach turn into absolute freezing panic. His slick lawyer stood frozen, completely confused by the sudden terrifying shift in the room. Judge Gallagher was not looking at a plea for mercy. He was not looking at a medical report. He was staring directly at the highly classified, encrypted banking records of his own secret offshore account. The exact account where Preston had wired the $200,000 bribe just hours ago. The document detailed every single illicit transfer he had ever accepted in his entire corrupt career. It was a flawless federal evidence file that could put him in a maximum security prison for the next 30 years. But that was not the part that made his hands shake. The part that broke his mind was the name printed at the very top of the evidence file. The file was not submitted by the local police. It was formally submitted by the primary corporate creditor of Preston Real Estate. The document clearly stated that the financial tracking was executed and provided by V Legacy. Judge Gallagher slowly raised his terrified eyes from the paper. He looked past Dawson. He looked past the federal prosecutors. He looked directly at me. I was sitting at the defense table in my dark Italian suit, watching him with cold, dead eyes. In that exact moment, the corrupt judge finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He realized that the anonymous corporate phantom known as V Legacy was not some distant hedge fund. V Legacy was the old black man sitting right in front of him. I was the phantom. I was the billionaire predator who had just bought his entire life. The judge knew he was completely trapped, and the execution was about to begin. Preston stood up from his wooden chair. He did not understand why the judge was shaking. He slammed his hand on the plaintiff table. He demanded that the judge sign the conservatorship order immediately. He shouted that my sudden appearance was a trick and that I belonged in a hospital. He told the judge to stop wasting time and execute the document. Judge Gallagher could not even speak. He was completely paralyzed by the evidence folder in front of him. He knew that if he signed that paper, he would be sending himself to federal prison. He slowly pushed the document away from him and slumped back in his heavy leather chair. Dawson took the floor. He walked to the center of the room. He motioned to the court clerk. A massive projector screen descended from the ceiling behind the witness stand. Dawson pulled out a digital tablet. He pressed a single button. The courtroom was bathed in the bright light of the screen. The first document appeared. It was the fraudulent real estate appraisal signed in my living room. Dawson explained that Preston had brought a crooked appraiser to my house to intentionally undervalue the property at $200,000. He then projected the confidential city planning documents. He revealed the secret infrastructure project. He told the entire courtroom that the land was actually worth $100 million because of the subterranean water rights. He stated that Preston was committing federal real estate fraud to steal that money. Preston's face turned bright red. He stammered and tried to object. His slick defense attorney suddenly took 2 steps away from the table. The lawyer realized his client was going down and he wanted no part of the blast radius. Dawson pressed another button. The screen changed. It displayed a series of offshore bank transfers. Dawson explained that Preston was completely bankrupt. He showed the financial records proving Preston owed $50 million to a violent Russian crime syndicate. He told the court that Preston was trying to use my stolen estate to pay off his massive criminal debts. Maya looked at Preston with wide eyes. She had known about the money problems, but she did not know about the Russian mob. She suddenly realized the extreme danger she was in. She grabbed Preston by the arm, but he violently shoved her hand away. Dawson was not finished. He projected the fake medical affidavit signed by Dr. Aris. Beside it, he projected security camera footage from my neighborhood. The footage clearly showed that the doctor had never visited my house. Dawson displayed the exact wire transfer Preston used to bribe the fake psychiatrist. He announced that this was a coordinated federal conspiracy to kidnap an innocent man and strip him of his human rights. The men and women of my board of directors watched in absolute silence. Their cold stares bore into Preston. They were watching a tiny insect being crushed by a monolith. Preston was hyperventilating. He looked around the room like a trapped animal. He yelled that none of this mattered. He screamed that his corporate debt had been bought out by a major financial institution. He shouted that he was protected by a massive conglomerate called V Legacy, and that they would destroy anyone who got in his way. He actually thought the Phantom Company was going to save him from this nightmare. I slowly stood up from the defense table. I buttoned my custom Italian suit jacket. I walked past Dawson and stood directly in front of Preston. Dawson pressed the final button on his tablet. The screen went completely black for a second. Then a single highly classified corporate document appeared. It was the absolute ownership charter for V Legacy. Dawson spoke with a voice that echoed like thunder in the silent room. He announced that V Legacy was not a hedge fund. He stated that it was a private ghost trust completely owned and operated by the shadow founder of Interstate Logistics. Dawson pointed directly at me. He told the courtroom that I was the sole owner of V Legacy. Preston stopped breathing. His eyes darted from the massive projector screen down to my face. He looked at the tailored suit I was wearing. He looked at the terrifying men sitting in the gallery. He looked at the cold, dead expression in my eyes. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. I was not the victim he thought he had manipulated. I was the anonymous corporate entity that had bought his $50 million debt from the Russian mob. I was the supreme creditor who had frozen every single one of his bank accounts the night before. I was the man who owned his company, his house, his cars, and his entire future. Preston realized that he had spent the last week trying to dig a grave for a billionaire predator. He realized that I had let him lock me in a psychiatric ward just to gather enough federal evidence to ensure he would never see the light of day again. I was not his prey. I was his executioner. "You are bankrupt, Preston," I said, my voice low and smooth. "You owe me $50 million, and I am collecting the debt today." Preston's mind completely shattered. The arrogance, the greed, the superiority, it all evaporated into pure primal terror. He looked at Maya sitting next to him. He did not offer his hand to her. He did not tell her he loved her. He looked at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. Preston turned his back on his wife. He kicked his wooden chair out of the way. He broke into a dead sprint, running down the center aisle toward the exit, trying to escape the absolute destruction he had brought upon himself. Preston kicked his wooden chair out of the way. He broke into a dead sprint, running down the center aisle of the courtroom. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly on the polished marble floor. He was breathing heavily, his mind completely consumed by pure panic. He thought he could just run away from the absolute nightmare he had created. He thought he could reach the heavy wooden doors and disappear into the crowded streets of Chicago. He reached out his trembling hands to push the oak doors open, but he never touched the wood. The heavy doors suddenly swung inward with massive force. Preston stumbled backward, losing his balance. Standing in the doorway blocking his only escape route were two massive men wearing dark windbreakers. The bright yellow letters printed across their chests spelled out the end of his life. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dawson had not just been sitting in his office playing with corporate documents. He had sent the entire evidence file regarding the wire fraud and the Russian syndicate directly to his contacts at the Federal Bureau early that morning. The agents had been waiting quietly in the hallway the entire time. They were just waiting for Dawson to spring the trap inside the courtroom. The lead federal agent stepped forward and grabbed Preston by the collar of his custom-tailored suit. He slammed Preston hard against the heavy wooden door. Preston let out a pathetic gasp of pain as the wind was knocked out of his lungs. The agent twisted Preston's arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the exact same sound I had heard when the police locked me in cuffs on my front porch. But this time, the chains were entirely justified. The agent spoke in a loud, clear voice. He announced that Preston was under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. He also mentioned an ongoing investigation into international money laundering connected to organized crime. The words hung heavy in the air. Preston's legs gave out completely. He slumped against the wooden door, sobbing uncontrollably like a terrified child. He twisted his head around and looked back down the aisle. He looked at Maya. She was still sitting at the plaintiff's table. She had not moved a single inch. Preston screamed her name. He begged her to help him. He pleaded with her to call their lawyers or access their emergency funds. He cried out that he could not go to federal prison. But Maya just sat there completely frozen in absolute shock. The wealthy life she had worshipped was vaporizing right in front of her eyes. The summer house in the Hamptons was gone. The country club memberships were gone. Her husband was a bankrupt criminal who owed $50 million to violent men and was now heading to a federal penitentiary. She realized that she had thrown her father into a psychiatric ward for absolutely nothing. Her entire reality was crumbling into dust. She did not say a word to Preston. She just stared blankly at the marble floor as the federal agents dragged her screaming husband out of the courtroom. With Preston gone, the heavy silence returned to the room. Dawson turned his attention back to the high wooden bench. Judge Gallagher was still gripping the edges of his desk, his face completely pale. He was breathing in short, frantic gasps. He knew the FBI agents were standing just outside the doors. He knew the evidence folder on his desk contained his own financial death warrant. Dawson walked slowly up to the wooden barrier. He looked at the corrupt judge with absolute disgust. He spoke in a low, calm voice that carried perfectly across the silent room. He told Judge Gallagher that V. Legacy had already forwarded the records of his offshore bribe to the Judicial Oversight Committee. He stated that the federal prosecutors standing behind me were fully prepared to issue an indictment before the court closed today. Dawson paused, letting the threat sink deep into the judge's mind. Then he offered a single narrow exit. Dawson told the judge that if he recused himself from this case immediately and submitted his formal resignation from the bench right now, the prosecutors might consider delaying the indictment. Judge Gallagher did not have a choice. His career was completely over. His reputation was entirely destroyed. He picked up his wooden gavel with shaking hands. He could barely speak into the microphone. His voice cracked as he formally recused himself from the conservatorship hearing, citing an immediate and profound conflict of interest. He then announced his immediate resignation from the federal judiciary. He stood up from his heavy leather chair, took off his black robe, and dropped it onto the floor. He walked out the back door of the courtroom looking like a broken, defeated old man. Dawson looked back at me and gave a small nod. The board of directors sitting in the gallery remained perfectly silent. They had just watched their chairman dismantle a federal judge and a corrupt CEO in less than 20 minutes without raising his voice once. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened again. One of the federal agents stepped back inside holding a secure radio. He looked directly at Dawson and confirmed that the secondary target had been secured. Dr. Aris had been arrested in the hospital hallway just 10 minutes ago. The fake doctor was caught trying to shred documents in his office. He was currently in the back of a federal transport vehicle facing decades in prison for medical fraud and perjury. Every single piece of Preston corrupt machine had been systematically dismantled and destroyed. The only piece left was sitting at the plaintiff's table. Maya slowly raised her head. The arrogant smirk she had worn when she walked into the courtroom was completely gone. Her designer dress suddenly looked cheap and pathetic. She realized that Preston assets were all frozen. She realized that the Russian syndicate would be looking for anyone connected to the missing money. She realized that she was listed as the co-signer on several of Preston fraudulent real estate holding companies. She was completely broke and she was facing accessory charges that could put her in a cell right next to her husband. She slowly stood up from her chair. Her legs were trembling so badly she could barely support her own weight. She looked at me sitting calmly in my expensive tailored suit. She looked at the immense power radiating from the silent gallery behind me. Her pride completely shattered. She realized the terrible magnitude of what she had done to her own flesh and blood. She took a step toward me, and her knees gave out. She dropped to the cold marble floor. She did not stand back up. She began to crawl. She crawled on her hands and knees down the center aisle of the courtroom, dragging her expensive white dress across the dirty floor. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She crawled until she reached the edge of my table. She reached up with shaking hands, trying to grab the edge of my suit jacket. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She sobbed uncontrollably, her chest heaving with desperate panic. "Daddy!" she cried out, her voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. "Daddy, please help me!" She begged me to forgive her. She swore she did not know the full extent of Preston crimes. She pleaded with me to use my lawyers to protect her from the federal charges. She cried that she was my only child and that I could not let her go to prison. The woman who had told me to rot in a concrete cell just 2 nights ago was now begging for her life at my feet. The absolute destruction of her fake world was complete. Maya remained on her hands and knees on the cold marble floor. She reached out with her trembling fingers, trying to grasp the fabric of my suit jacket. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She kept repeating the word "daddy" over and over again. She sounded exactly like she did when she was a little girl begging for a new toy or a new dress. But she was not a little girl anymore. She was a grown woman who had just tried to bury her own father alive. She sobbed and pleaded for my protection. She told me she was terrified. She told me she did not want to go to a federal prison. She promised she would change her ways. She swore she would leave Preston and come back home to take care of me forever. She begged me to call my lawyers and make the federal agents go away. I stood perfectly still and looked down at her. I did not reach out to help her up from the floor. I did not offer her a handkerchief to wipe her tears. I just looked at the pathetic, broken shell of the daughter I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. I thought about the 14-hour shifts I worked at the cold garage just to buy her a bicycle. I thought about how her mother Vivian used to sit up late at night sewing her dance costumes so she would look like all the other wealthy children at her private school. We gave her absolutely everything we had. We poured all our love and all our money into making sure she never knew the brutal struggle of poverty. But that wealth had completely poisoned her soul. It had turned her into a parasite who valued a country club membership over the life of the man who gave her breath. She had looked at my life and saw nothing but a dollar sign. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for her loud, pathetic sobbing. Dawson and the 2 federal prosecutors stood behind me, watching the scene without a single ounce of pity. The board of directors in the gallery remained perfectly still. Everyone was waiting for my final verdict. Maya grabbed my polished leather shoe. She pressed her wet face against it and begged me for mercy one last time. I slowly stepped back, pulling my foot away from her desperate grasp. She looked up, completely panicked by the physical rejection. I looked deep into her eyes. I wanted her to remember this exact moment for the rest of her miserable life. I spoke with a voice that was completely empty. It had no anger and no sorrow. It was the absolute voice of a judge delivering a final, unchangeable sentence. "You traded your blood for a country club membership, Maya," I said. "You sold my life to keep a summer house in the Hamptons. You sat across from me in that psychiatric ward and you told me to rot in a concrete cell. You made your choice. You chose Preston and you chose his stolen money. Now you will suffer the exact consequences of that choice. You are no longer my daughter." The words hung heavy in the cold air of the courtroom. Maya let out a loud, agonizing scream. She collapsed onto her stomach, pounding her fists against the hard marble floor. She realized it was truly over. The protective shield of my wealth was permanently gone. The federal agents were going to come for her next, and she had absolutely no one left to save her. I did not stay to watch her cry. I turned my back on her and began to walk away. I walked down the long center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors were still wide open from when the federal agents dragged Preston away. As I walked past the wooden benches, the men and women of my board of directors bowed their heads in deep, silent respect. They knew they had just witnessed a masterclass in absolute corporate warfare. I did not say a word to them. I just kept walking. The sound of my leather shoes clicking against the floor drowned out the sound of Maya sobbing behind me. I stepped out of the courtroom and into the bright marble hallway of the federal building. I took the elevator down to the main floor. The security guards who had watched Preston and Maya walk in like royalty earlier that morning now watched me walk out like a conquering emperor. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The crisp, freezing air of the Chicago winter hit my face. It felt incredibly clean. It felt like absolute freedom. The heavy burden I had been carrying for the past week was completely gone. I was no longer the victim of a greedy family. I was no longer a shadow hiding from the world. I breathed in the icy air and let out a long, slow exhale. A massive black Phantom Rolls-Royce was idling perfectly at the bottom of the courthouse steps. The dark paint was so polished it reflected the gray winter sky. The chauffeur, a tall man in a dark, immaculate suit, saw me approaching. He immediately stepped around the vehicle and opened the heavy rear door. He bowed his head respectfully as I approached. I climbed into the warm, luxurious interior of the car. The leather seats felt incredible after days of sleeping on a thin plastic mattress in an isolation cell. Dawson walked down the steps a moment later and got into the car, sitting across from me. He closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the city completely. The driver smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging into the busy downtown traffic. Dawson looked at me and asked for my final orders regarding the estate and the legal proceedings. I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers passing by. I thought about the modest wooden house on the south side. I thought about the beautiful memories Vivian and I had made there when we were young and full of hope. But those memories were tainted now. Preston had drilled the locks. Maya had betrayed the very foundation of our family inside those walls. The house was no longer a home. It was a monument to their greed. It was time to build something completely new, something that could never be corrupted by money or selfishness. I turned my attention back to Dawson. My voice was calm and filled with absolute purpose. "Tear down the South Side house, Dawson," I said. "Bring in the demolition crews tomorrow morning and level it to the ground. Then sell the subterranean water rights directly to the city planners for the full $100 million. Dawson nodded, typing the commands into his secure digital tablet. "And what do you want to do with the surface land and the money, sir?" he asked. I smiled a genuine warm smile for the first time in a very long time. "We are keeping the surface land," I replied. "And we are going to use every single dollar of that city payout to build something beautiful. We are building the Vivian Montgomery Children's Hospital right on that exact block. We are going to provide free elite medical care to every poor family on the South Side. We are going to turn a place of betrayal into a place of absolute healing. My wife loved children, and now her name will protect them for generations to come." Dawson smiled a rare, genuine smile of his own. "It will be an honor to execute that order, Mr. Montgomery," he said. I leaned back against the rich leather seat and closed my eyes. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly through the winter streets, carrying me back to my corporate empire. Behind me in the cold marble halls of the courthouse, the traitors were left entirely alone to drown in the dark ruins of their own pathetic greed. They had tried to bury an old man, but they only succeeded in burying themselves. The Shadow War was over, and the new order had officially begun. The greatest lesson I learned from all of this is that blood does not automatically make someone family. Real family is defined by mutual respect and absolute loyalty. I spent my entire life trying to buy my daughter happiness, but I only ended up funding her greed. You cannot protect people from the consequences of their own actions forever. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is step aside and let the fire burn. Never underestimate the quiet strength of the people who sacrificed everything to build the ground you walk on. Because the moment you forget your foundation is the exact moment your entire world will collapse. Let me know in the comments if you would have forgiven Maya, or if you believe she got exactly what she deserved.